November 200 BC, the arid coast of Peru. The sun beats down upon the desert, but beneath the shifting sands lies a civilization that mastered the very ground they walked upon. Long before the Incas would rise to dominate the Andes, the Paracas people were thriving in what is now southern Peru. In the late 3rd millennium BC, they began a journey of artistic and technological evolution that would define the pre-Inca era. The Paracas were not merely survivors of this harsh environment, they were innovators. While the Incas are famous for their stone masonry, the Paracas mastered the art of textiles. Their burial cloths, woven from camelid fleece, depict complex cosmologies and deities, serving as the earliest known pictorial records in the Americas. These books of cloth reveal a society deeply connected to the sea, the lifeblood of the coastal desert. As the centuries turned to roughly 100 AD, a new culture emerged in the same coastal region, the Nazca. If the Paracas were artists of the small scale, the Nazca were engineers of the vast landscape. Around 200 BC, they began to carve their secrets into the earth, creating the mysterious geoglyphs that remain visible only from the sky. This monumental feat required immense communal cooperation and an advanced understanding of hydrology and astronomy. The Nazca lines are not just abstract drawings. They align with celestial events, suggesting a civilization that viewed the sky as a map for ritual and survival. Their culture flourished from roughly 500 BC to 500 AD, creating a legacy of geometric precision and spiritual connection to the cosmos that would eventually inspire the spiritual and astronomical practices of the rising Inca Empire. However, it was the Moche civilization that truly challenged the notion of the Incas as the first great builders of the region. Emerging around 100 AD in the northern coast of Peru, the Moche constructed the massive adobe city of Chan Chan centuries before the Incas ever built stone fortresses. The Moche were master metallurgists, goldsmiths, and ceramicists. Their portrait vessels, painted with striking realism, offer a rare glimpse into the daily lives and social hierarchies of the time. But it was their religious fervor that left the most enduring mark. They built the Great Pyramid of Huaca de la Luna, a massive adobe structure adorned with grotesque and terrifying depictions of deities, suggesting a state religion that demanded absolute loyalty. The Moche flourished from approximately 100 to 700 AD, reaching their peak complexity right before the collapse of the regional kingdoms due to environmental changes and the rise of the Chimu. These three cultures did not exist in isolation. They laid the foundational blocks upon which the Inca Empire would be constructed. The Paracas taught the Andean people the power of textile as a medium of history and status, a tradition the Incas would later elevate to its highest form of economic and political power. The Nazca demonstrated the ability to manipulate the desert landscape for ritual and practical purposes, a skill the Incas would expand upon in their massive agricultural terraces and water management systems. Most significantly, the Moche established the precedent of the centralized, deity-focused state, utilizing monumental architecture and standardized art to project imperial authority. When the Incas finally unified the region, they did not start from zero. They inherited a world where the concepts of state religion, monumental construction, and sophisticated resource management were already deeply embedded in Andean society. The Incas refined these legacies, replacing adobe with stone, but the vision of a unified, divinely sanctioned empire stretching across the Andes was built on the shoulders of these pre-Inca giants. The Paracas, Nazca, and Moche proved that the Peruvian coast could sustain complex societies, creating a cultural continuum that made the eventual rise of Tahuantinsuyu not a sudden surprise, but the culmination of over 1,000 years of innovation and adaptation. In 600 CE, in the high valleys surrounding the Vilcanota River, a new power began to stir, one that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Andean history long before the name Inca would echo across the globe. This was the emergence of the Wari, the first true regional kingdom to rise in the heart of the Andes, breaking the cycle of isolated chiefdoms that had previously dominated the landscape. While their southern neighbor, the Chavin, had faded into myth and their northern contemporaries like the Moche were consolidating their coastal dominion, the Wari looked not just outward, but inward and upward, engineering a state apparatus that would serve as the blueprint for the later Inca Empire. Situated strategically in modern-day Ayacucho, the Wari capital was not merely a settlement. It was a monumental declaration of imperial will. Unlike the organic, winding layout of many pre-Inca cities, the Wari urban plan was a rigid grid, a geometric manifestation of cosmic order imposed upon the earth. Massive adobe walls encircled the city, protecting not just the people, but the ideology of the state. At its center stood the temples of the sun, towering structures of sun-dried brick that served as the religious and political nucleus, signaling a shift from local worship to a centralized cult of authority. What made the Wari truly revolutionary was their mastery over water and agriculture, transforming the harsh Andean environment into a breadbasket of empire. They perfected the art of hydraulic engineering, constructing an intricate network of canals, fountains, and reservoirs that distributed water with surgical precision. This technological marvel allowed for the cultivation of crops in the high altitude where few could survive, fueling a population boom that necessitated a more complex form of governance. The Wari did not just live in a city. They lived within a machine designed to extract, process, and redistribute wealth, a system that would later be perfected by Pachacuti. Their influence was not confined to stone and water. The Wari spread their cultural footprint far beyond their capital, exporting their artistic styles, their architectural motifs, and their religious iconography into regions as distant as the southern coast and the northern highlands. Archaeologists find Wari pottery shards and distinct ceramic styles in places thousands of miles away, evidence of a vast trade network and a soft power that commanded loyalty without the need for constant military occupation. They established satellite settlements and administrative outposts, creating a web of dependency that integrated disparate tribes into a single economic sphere. Yet the Wari were not invincible. By the 10th century, internal strife and perhaps ecological shifts began to erode their foundations. The great adobe walls that once shielded the capital crumbled, and the vibrant grids of the city were slowly overtaken by the encroaching pampas. The empire fractured, and the regional unity they forged began to dissolve. However, their legacy did not vanish with their fall. The Wari left behind a genetic and cultural code in the Andean world. When Manco Capac would eventually rise in Cusco nearly 1,000 years later, he would inherit a landscape already primed for empire. The roads, the terracing techniques, the concept of a central capital, and the administrative strategies pioneered by the Wari were all waiting to be picked up by the rising sun of the Inca state. In the end, the Wari were the silent architects of the future. They proved that a high-altitude civilization could project power over vast distances, manage complex resources, and impose a unified identity on a fragmented land. They laid the foundation upon which the greatest empire the Americas would ever know would eventually be built. Without the wary, the Incas might have remained a powerful but isolated kingdom. Instead, thanks to the foresight and engineering of the wary, the stage was set for the rise of Tahuantinsuyu, a destiny that would change the world forever. 1200 AD, the rugged, mist-shrouded highlands of the Peruvian Andes, specifically the glacial peaks of the Cordillera Blanca. Here, in the remote valley known as Pacarictambo, the great Andean Empire would soon take its first breath. While the Spanish conquistadors and later chroniclers like Garcilaso de la Vega would spin a narrative of divine destiny, the origins of the Inca state were deeply rooted in a complex tapestry of mythology, political strategy, and the unifying power of a sacred story. This is the tale of Manco Capac, the first Sapa Inca, and his journey from a humble stone cobbler to the mythical son of the sun god. According to the Cusco tradition, as recorded in the Mitma Kuna and later codified by European observers, the world was not always ready for the Sun King. In the beginning, the earth was cold and barren, the rivers ran backward, and humanity lived in ignorance and fear. The sun, Inti, grew weary of his people's suffering and dispatched his children, Viracocha and Mamaquilla, to descend into the mortal realm to find the chosen one who would bring order and civilization. The myth speaks of a humble beginning. Manco Capac and his sister and wife, Mama Aklo, were not born to royalty but were sent from the celestial realm to the earthly plane. Their divine mission was disguised as a test of character. Legend holds that they began at Pacarictambo, the place of the beginning, where Manco Capac was tasked with shaping the land. In the classic version of the myth, he was instructed to take a golden staff and touch the ground. If he were worthy, the earth would yield a spring of water and the people would thrive. If he failed, he would return to the sun. This moment at Pacarictambo was less about geological discovery and more about spiritual validation. It was a narrative device designed to legitimize Inca rule over the fragmented highland tribes who inhabited the Cusco Valley. The Incas did not arise in a vacuum. They were a chiefdom among many, competing with the Chavin, Paracas, and Nazca legacies that had already shaped the region. By claiming a divine mandate, Manco Capac transformed a local warlord into a cosmic figure. His journey from the misty Pacarictambo to the sun-drenched valley of Cusco was not merely a migration, it was an act of creation. As the brothers and sister traveled south, they did not simply walk, they brought the sun with them. The myth suggests that wherever they went, the land became fertile, rivers flowed in their proper direction, and agriculture flourished. This is a profound metaphor for the Inca worldview, where the Sapa Inca was the living link between the divine realm and the earthly plane. His presence guaranteed cosmic balance. Upon reaching Cusco, Manco Capac planted his staff, and the mythical spring emerged, forever marking the city as the navel of the world, the asterisk calca of the sun. However, historians must look beyond the legend. The transition from Pacarictambo to Cusco likely mirrored the actual political consolidation of the wary-influenced cultures of the South. The myth served a pragmatic purpose, to unify disparate highland clans under a single banner, by establishing Cusco not just as a fortress, but as the mythical birthplace of civilization. The Incas created a shared cultural identity that transcended local loyalties. The founding myth of Manco Capac is therefore a dual narrative. It is a story of gods descending to save a cold, broken world, and simultaneously a political manifesto declaring the supremacy of the Cusco Valley over the Andean Plateau. It established a lineage that would stretch for centuries, connecting the humble cobbler of the mountains to the grandeur of Machu Picchu and the vast reach of Tawantinsuyu. From this sacred starting point, the stage was set for the rise of an empire that would dominate the heart of South America, all anchored in the enduring belief that the sun and his chosen child ruled the earth. 1100 BCE, the high slopes of the Vilcabamba Range. In the shadow of the towering snow-capped peaks of the Andes, a small community of hunters and farmers began to coalesce into something far greater than a mere village. This was Cusco, the navel of the world according to later Incan belief, though at this precise moment in time, it was simply the stronghold of the Capan Inca, a chieftaindom struggling for survival in a landscape of fractured tribes. For centuries, the highlands of southern Peru had been a chaotic tapestry of warring city-states, each claiming dominion over their local valleys and sacred springs, with no single power capable of imposing order. It was here, amidst the dust of ancient stone and the mist of the mountains, that the seeds of a future empire were sown, not by a vast army, but by a shrewd political marriage and a charismatic leader who understood that unity was the only path to security. The catalyst for this transformation arrived with the figure of Manco Capac, the legendary founder whose mythic journey from the island of the sun to the rocky basin of Cusco provided the spiritual legitimacy necessary to bind disparate groups together. While the myths speak of a golden staff and divine origin, the historical reality was a pragmatic unification of the ruling clans. Under Manco Capac and his successors, the Capan state ceased to be a localized chiefdom and evolved into the Kingdom of Cusco, a centralized entity capable of projecting power beyond its immediate borders. This was not achieved through immediate, total conquest, but through a delicate dance of diplomacy and coercion. The early Incas recognized the futility of fighting every neighboring tribe individually. Instead, they employed a strategy of allying with powerful lineages, integrating them into the Cusco court, and gradually eroding their independence. By approximately 1000 CE, the Kingdom of Cusco had successfully unified the highland tribes of the Cusco Valley, creating a buffer zone of loyalty that shielded the heartland from external threats. This unification was solidified by the construction of stone settlements that mimicked the sacred geography of the landscape, aligning the city's architecture with the movement of the sun and the stars. The ruling dynasty established a system where local leaders, or curacas asterisk, were allowed to govern their own territories provided they acknowledged the supremacy of the Cusco Sapa Inca, the lord of the land. This feudal-like arrangement allowed the kingdom to expand without the logistical nightmare of administering every remote village directly. The Incas utilized the existing social structures of the highland tribes, co-opting local religious cults and weaving them into a broader imperial ideology that placed the sun god, Inti, at the center of all existence. As the kingdom grew, so did its military capabilities. The unification of the highlands provided a stable population base for a standing army and a reliable food supply from intensive agriculture, allowing the Cusco rulers to look outward with confidence. The period marked the transition from a collection of rival chiefdoms to a true state apparatus, where tribute flowed into the capital and labor was mobilized for public works. This era of consolidation laid the foundational stone for the Tahuantinsuyu that would rise generations later. The Kingdom of Cusco was no longer just a village on the Andes. It was the nucleus of a civilization that would learn to harness the very mountains they inhabited, turning the fragmented tribes of the highlands into a single, formidable engine of expansion. Through strategic marriage, religious synthesis, and the careful integration of local elites, the Incas forged a unity that would prove resilient enough to withstand the centuries of turmoil to come, setting the stage for the rise of the greatest empire the Andes had ever known. June 1463, Cusco. The air in the high valley hung heavy with the scent of burning torches and the metallic tang of impending war. Here, nestled in a natural amphitheater carved into the side of a mountain, the small polity of Cusco stood at a precarious crossroads. To its south and east lay the rugged, fertile lands of the Kala people. To its west, the arid, water-scarred coast. For generations, the ruler of this valley, known as Meditative, had presided over a loose confederation of highland tribes, united more by geography than by a shared destiny. But Meditative saw something the ancestors had missed: the potential of the valley not just as a home, but as a forge. Under his son, Capac Yupanqui, and later his grandson, Inca Capac, the small kingdom began to stretch its arms outward, swallowing neighboring settlements with a voracious appetite for land and labor. The conquest of the valley was not a single event, but a grinding campaign of consolidation that transformed a tribal chiefdom into an imperial engine. Unlike the later, lightning-fast conquests of the empire, this early expansion was methodical and brutal. The Incas did not merely annex territories. They dismantled the local power structures. Tribal leaders were stripped of their authority, often replaced by Inca governors who reported directly to the Sapa Inca. The local deities, once the objects of fierce worship, were systematically uprooted from their sacred shrines and dragged to the capital, Cusco. They were forced to kneel before the newly elevated status of the sun god, Inti, signaling a radical shift in the spiritual landscape. This was the first great act of cultural assimilation, a psychological warfare that ensured loyalty before a single stone was laid for a new fortress. As the valley united, the Incas turned their gaze to the strategic necessity of infrastructure. The scattered hamlets of the valley were connected by a web of causeways, designed not just for trade but for the rapid movement of armies. It was during this era that the concept of ***, the labor tax, began to take its modern form. Commoners were conscripted into the state workforce, tasked with building roads, terracing hillsides, and constructing granaries. These were not acts of charity, but the foundational bricks of a centralized state. The wealth generated from the fertile valleys flowed into the royal treasury, funding the expansionist wars that would soon drag the Incas into the heart of the Andes. By the time Manco Capac ascended to the throne in the mid-15th century, the transformation of Cusco was complete. What had been a collection of warring tribes was now a cohesive, militarized state with a unified administration, a standardized language, and a singular purpose: expansion. The valley had ceased to be a mere geographic feature. It had become the beating heart of the Tahuantinsuyu. The lessons learned here: the importance of controlling the water sources, the power of religious unity, the efficiency of a forced labor system, would serve as the blueprint for the greatest empire the pre-Columbian Americas would ever know. As Manco Capac looked out over the unified landscape, he understood that the stage was set. The small kingdom was no longer content to exist. It was ready to conquer the world. The heart of the empire had been built, and now it was time to pump blood through its veins and conquer the horizons beyond the valley's rim. 1300 CE, the rugged highlands of Cusco. The air is thin, thin enough to make breath laborious, yet the spirit of the people here is thick with the promise of destiny. For centuries, this region had been a patchwork of small, autonomous chiefdoms, each governed by a local warlord known as a *Curaka*. They were neighbors, yes, but rivals. They traded goods, but they rarely trusted one another. Their gods were distinct, their rituals varied, and their ambitions limited to the immediate valley floor. But change was in the wind, a shift driven by a leader whose vision would tear through the fabric of the old order and stitch together a new reality. This man was Manco Capac, the legendary founder, and his successor, Sinchiroca, who would lay the first stones of an empire that would one day stretch from the arid coast to the misty Amazon. The transition from a loose confederation of chiefdoms to a centralized empire did not happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate process of integration born from necessity and ambition. Under Sinchiroca, the *Curacas of Cusco began to assert a dominance that went beyond mere military might. They started to demand tribute, not just in gold or textiles, but in labor and loyalty. The small villages surrounding Cusco were no longer equal partners in a tribal alliance. They were becoming subjects in a growing dominion. The Incas realized that to survive the harsh Andean climate and to secure their food supply, they could not rely solely on their own scattered fields. They needed a unified command. This era marked the beginning of the *Mida*, the precursor to the famous labor tax that would later build the Quhapac Nyan. Unlike the sporadic trade exchanges of the past, this was a state-mandated obligation. Men from the conquered valleys were conscripted to work on public projects, terracing steep mountain slopes, clearing drainage channels, and maintaining the sacred springs of the capital. It was a radical concept for the region. Suddenly, a farmer in the valley was no longer just a farmer. He was a cog in a state machine, contributing to the glory of the Sapa Inca, the one only Lord. This shift fundamentally altered the social contract. The *Curaca lost some of his autonomy, becoming a local administrator appointed by the central power in Cusco. The tribal leaders were co-opted, given Inca titles, and integrated into the imperial hierarchy, ensuring that the old elites became the very tools of the new state's control. The architectural landscape of Cusco began to reflect this new identity. The scattered stone structures of the earlier chiefdoms were consolidated into a grand urban plan centered around the Plaza de Armas. The Incas were no longer building for a single clan. They were building for an eternal dynasty. Temples were constructed not just to appease local spirits, but to house the state religion centered on Inti, the sun god. By standardizing religious worship and placing the Sun King at its apex, the Incas created a spiritual glue that bound the disparate tribes together. To serve the sun was to serve the empire. By the time the lineage reached Lok Yupanqui and Meda Capac, the transformation was undeniable. The kingdom of Cusco had shed its modest origins. It was no longer a collection of villages looking out for themselves. It was a formidable political entity projecting power outward. The first steps of expansion were taken not with the lightning-fast conquests of later emperors like Pachacuti, but with a steady, grinding advance. The Incas learned to conquer the land and the minds of the people simultaneously. They understood that an empire is not just territory held by sword. It is a network of loyalty maintained by road, by record, and by ritual. As the sun set over the ancient valley of Cusco in this formative period, a new shadow lengthened across the Andes, one that would soon encompass the entire continent, turning the disparate chiefdoms of the past into the unified superstate of Tahuantinsuyu. The era of the small kingdom was over. The age of the empire had begun. January 1462, the rugged highlands of Cusco. The air was thick with the scent of burning llama fat and the low murmur of a kingdom in flux. In the modest palace of the Inca Sapani Inca Yupanqui, a young prince named Pachacuti lay dying. He did not merely die. He sparked a transformation that would shatter the very fabric of the Andean world and forge a new reality from the rubble. Before his death, he had already begun the slow, agonizing work of changing his name from Prince to Pachacutic, a title meaning the Earth Shaker. This was not a name given in jest, but a prophecy fulfilled through blood and stone. The man who would soon rule as Pachacuti had spent his early years not as a ruler, but as a general, leading the modest forces of Cusco against the encroaching giants of the southern highlands. The wars of Pachacuti's youth were brutal necessities. For decades, the southern tribes, particularly the Kala and Lupaca confederations, had dominated the southern plateau, viewing Cusco as a mere tributary chiefdom. They were a formidable alliance of warriors, far stronger in numbers and more unified in purpose than the fragmented highland tribes of Cusco. When young Pachacuti took command, he faced an empire that seemed destined to swallow Cusco whole. Yet, he refused to fight on their terms. Instead, he reorganized the Cusco military into a professional standing army, abandoning the traditional reliance on seasonal levies. He introduced new tactics, utilizing the steep terrain of the Andes to negate the numerical superiority of his enemies. These early campaigns were not glorious parades of conquest, but grinding, bloody struggles for survival. Every victory expanded the territory of Cusco slightly, turning a series of skirmishes into a relentless tide of expansion that pushed the southern borders southward, claiming lands that had been independent for centuries. However, war alone could not build an empire that would last centuries. As Pachacuti ascended the throne, likely around 1438 or 1439, he understood that the old ways of ruling were insufficient. The kingdom had grown too large for a loose confederation of tribes. The transition from a regional chiefdom to a true superstate required a total overhaul of society. Pachacuti initiated a series of profound reforms that would become the backbone of Tahuantinsuyu. He redefined the role of the Sapa Inca, transforming him from a revered deity figure into an absolute, divinely mandated monarch. This was not merely a change in title, it was a complete shift in political philosophy. The Sapa Inca was no longer just the leader of the people. He was the owner of the land and the sole dispenser of justice. To enforce this new order, Pachacuti restructured the administration, creating a centralized bureaucracy that reached down to the smallest village. He established a network of royal officials, or curacas asterisk, who were often selected from conquered elites but loyal to Cusco, ensuring that local power never threatened the center. He also began to reshape the religious landscape, elevating the sun god, Inti, above all other deities. While the older gods of the earth and the mountains were not discarded, they were subordinated to the solar cult, creating a unified state religion that legitimized imperial rule. This was the moment the earth truly shook. Pachacuti did not just conquer land. He conquered the minds of the Andean people, weaving them into a single, cohesive entity. The wars of his youth had forged the steel. These reforms forged the soul of the Inca Empire. By the time the great walls of Cusco rose to meet the sky, they were not just built of stone, but laid upon the foundation of a society entirely remade by the will of one man who dared to shake the world. August 1509, high in the shadowed valleys of the central Andes, where the air grows thin and the earth trembles with the weight of history. Here, at Marcapamacacca, the waters of a mountain lake churned not from natural causes, but from the collision of two worlds destined to reshape the ancient Americas. This was the moment the Incas transitioned from a regional kingdom to a continental superpower, a single battle that would echo through centuries of human endeavor. Before this day, the realm centered on Cusco was merely one among many powerful polities in the Andean highlands. While they were skilled in stone and administration, their military reach was limited, often bogged down in local skirmishes against rival chiefdoms. The true architect of their destiny was then a young man named Pachacuti. Sitting on the throne of the Sapa Inca, he possessed a vision that transcended the status quo. He saw not just a kingdom, but an empire that could command the sun itself. His early campaigns against the Chanca Confederation had already demonstrated his ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. But it was this confrontation at Marcapamacacca that proved his genius was not merely tactical, but geopolitical. The Chanca were a formidable enemy, a loose confederation of tribes known for their superior cavalry, a rare asset in the high mountains, and their reputation for brutal warfare. They had grown bold, believing their numerical superiority and mobility would crush the Incas. They marched down from the high passes, expecting an easy victory over a fragmented population. They were wrong. Pachacuti had not merely built an army, he had forged a machine. He had united disparate highland tribes under a single banner, replacing old tribal loyalties with a new, terrifying sense of imperial identity. As the Chanca forces descended, they found themselves facing a defensive fortress of stone and strategy rather than an open field. Pachacuti lured the enemy into the narrow, winding valleys that surrounded the lake, a move that neutralized the Chanca's cavalry advantage. In the tight confines of the terrain, the Incas' superior discipline and close-order infantry tactics proved devastating. It was here that the Incas perfected the use of the sling, hurling stones with lethal precision from the rocky ridges above. The psychological impact was as much a weapon as the physical damage. The Chanca warriors, confident and arrogant, were suddenly caught in a trap of their own making. Their horses trapped on slippery slopes, their formations shattered by the relentless Incan assault. The battle was not merely a clash of arms, it was a crucible for a new political order. Pachacuti's victory was total, dismantling the Chanca threat once and for all. But its significance stretched far beyond the battlefield. The triumph at Marcapamacacca provided the momentum and the resources necessary to launch the massive expansion projects that followed. It was the catalyst that allowed Pachacuti to stop looking inward and start looking outward, initiating the aggressive conquests that would eventually stretch the empire from modern-day Ecuador to central Chile. In the aftermath, the geography of the Andes was redrawn. The concept of the state shifted fundamentally. The Sapa Inca was no longer just a chief among equals. He was the divine son of the sun, the absolute center of a vast network of control. The administrative structures were tightened, the road systems expanded, and the religious pantheon was unified under the worship of Inti. Marcapamacacca was the hinge upon which this transformation turned. Without that day of blood and stone, the Tahuantinsuyu might have remained a collection of smaller, rival kingdoms, vulnerable to collapse. Instead, it became the engine of a civilization that would dominate the continent for decades, leaving behind an architectural and cultural legacy that continues to awe the modern world. The lake at Marcapamacata still holds its waters, but for a brief, violent moment, it washed away the old order and birthed a new era of imperial history. September 1468, the high Andean plateau. The air is thin, biting cold, yet the ground trembles with a power unseen for centuries. Here, in the shadow of the sacred mountain of Urubamba, stands Pachacuti, not merely as a warrior who has just won battles, but as a visionary king who has just won a war of imagination. For decades, Cusco was a regional hub, a cluster of stone houses and temples surrounded by rival chiefdoms. But today, under Pachacuti's gaze, that cluster is dissolving, being unmade and remade into something far more vast, a unified empire. The name he gives to this new reality echoes through history, a word that would define his legacy forever: Tawantinsuyu. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must visualize the geography being rewritten before their eyes. Tawantinsuyu does not simply mean the four parts. It translates to the land of the four parts, a cosmological concept made manifest in stone and soil. Pachacuti divides the known world around the heart of Cusco, which serves as the navel of the universe. To the east lies Chinchaysuyu Asterisk, the region of the morning sun, home to the cool highlands and the Inca heartland itself. To the west stretches Antisuyu Asterisk, a mist-shrouded frontier of lush rainforests and the mysterious Amazon, a place of wild abundance and unknown spirits. To the north, Kuntasuyu Asterisk, the land of the south winds, where the sun's rays seem to cool as they travel down the mountain slopes. And to the south lies Kalasuyu Asterisk, the realm of the cold, southern winds, extending all the way to the Pacific coast and the lakes of the Altiplano. This was not merely an administrative convenience, it was a theological revolution. By dividing the empire into these four distinct quarters, Pachacuti was creating a new cosmic order where Cusco sat proudly in the center, holding the four corners of the world together. Before this, the Andes were a patchwork of autonomous tribes, each with their own gods, calendars, and kings. Now, through the lens of Tawantinsuyu, they were all fragments of a single, perfect whole. The map was redrawn not with ink on parchment, but with the logic of the state, ensuring that no corner of the empire felt too distant from the sun god, Inti, and his earthly representative, the Sapa Inca. The creation of these quarters required more than just a mental map. It demanded a complete restructuring of reality. Pachacuti had to convince disparate peoples that their local identities would not vanish, but would instead find a new, elevated home within the imperial structure. A farmer in Antisuyu and a herder in Kalasuyu were no longer isolated entities. They were citizens of a single, sprawling civilization. The boundaries of these quarters were drawn along natural divides, the river valleys, the mountain ranges, the wind directions, creating a system that felt organic to the Andean landscape while serving the rigid needs of imperial control. As the sun set over the newly defined borders in the late 15th century, the significance of Tawantinsuyu extended beyond politics. It represented the zenith of Inca thought, the belief that the earth was a living entity that could be ordered, balanced, and harmonized by human will. The four quarters were the limbs of the empire, and Cusco was the body that controlled them. This conceptual leap transformed a loose confederation of villages into a cohesive superstate capable of mobilizing resources, moving armies, and transporting goods across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The map was no longer just a guide for travelers. It was a declaration of unity, a promise that from this day forward, there was only one land, one people, and one sun. 1463, Cusco, Peru. For generations, this valley had been the spiritual heart of the highlands, a sacred place where the people believed the world was created. But under the visionary leadership of Pachacuti, the definition of this place would shift forever. He did not merely rule from here. He intended to remake the very fabric of reality around him, transforming Cusco from a modest chiefdom capital into a colossal temple dedicated to the sun god, Inti, and himself. Before Pachacuti, the city was an organic collection of tribal settlements, unified in name but distinct in practice. Pachacuti saw a vision far grander. He envisioned Cusco as a physical manifestation of the mythical origin of the world, the island of the sun floating in an ocean of milk. To achieve this, he ordered the construction of massive, circular terraces radiating outward from the sacred Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, mimicking the concentric rings of the island. These were not simple agricultural plots. They were sacred geography, turning the entire urban landscape into a ritualistic altar. The transformation was monumental in scale and ambition. Pachacuti initiated an unprecedented building campaign that dwarfed previous efforts. He recruited labor from across the newly conquered territories, utilizing the vast workforce of the emerging empire to drag stones from quarries hundreds of miles away. The most striking feature of this new Cusco was its integration with nature, specifically the Apis, or sacred mountains that guarded the valley. The city was designed to align perfectly with the surrounding peaks, including the sacred mountain of Huaracacha and the imposing presence of the Condoriri. By aligning the city's axes with these natural features, Pachacuti blurred the line between the built environment and the divine landscape, creating a city where the human and the natural worlds merged in perfect harmony. Central to this reimagining was the Coricancha itself. Under the old regime, it was a great temple. Under Pachacuti, it became the beating heart of the empire, a structure of impossible perfection. The walls were gilded in pure gold, said to shine so brightly they could be seen from the highest mountains at night. Every surface, from the floor tiles to the window grilles, was adorned with gold and precious metals, representing the body of the sun god. Inside, niches were carved to hold the images of celestial bodies, each one a testament to the cosmic order Pachacuti sought to impose. The temple was so sacred that no foreigner was permitted to enter, reinforcing the idea that the Sapa Inca was the sole intermediary between the people and the divine. Beyond the sacred center, the city was reorganized into 4 distinct quarters, corresponding to the 4 directions of the empire and the 4 celestial bodies revered by the Incas: the sun, the moon, Venus, and the constellation of the Pleiades. Each quarter housed the descendants of the original ruling families and served as a model for the administrative divisions of Tahuantinsuyu. This urban planning was not just aesthetic, it was a political statement. It signaled that the chaos of the pre-Inca past had been tamed into a harmonious, divinely ordered system. The construction required a level of engineering precision that remains unmatched. Massive stones, some weighing dozens of tons, were fitted together so tightly that not even a blade of grass could fit between them. This technique, known as ashlar masonry, allowed the buildings to withstand earthquakes and the test of time. The streets were paved and graded for drainage, ensuring the city remained clean and functional even in the heavy rains of the Andes. By the time of his death, Pachacuti had transformed Cusco into a marvel of the ancient world, a city that seemed less built by human hands and more grown from the earth itself. It was a testament to the power of a singular vision, a place where the ruler's will was indistinguishable from the will of the gods. This reimagined capital would serve as the beacon of the Inca Empire, drawing people from every corner of the continent to witness the glory of the Sun King's creation, setting the stage for an empire that would stretch from present-day Colombia to Chile. Circa 1438, the rugged highlands of Cusco, now the pulsating heart of a rapidly expanding empire. It was here, under the visionary gaze of Sapa Inca Pachacuti, that the foundations for one of the most ambitious engineering feats in pre-Columbian history were laid. While the Incas had long been master builders of stone, their true vision was not merely to construct temples or fortresses, but to weave their disparate territories into a single, cohesive machine. The answer to this logistical nightmare was the Q-Hapak Nyan, or the Royal Road, a vast network of highways that would eventually span over 25,000 kilometers, stretching from the arid deserts of modern-day Ecuador in the north to the temperate valleys of Chile in the south. This was not a simple path for travelers. It was the circulatory system of the Tahuantinsuyu. Before this great road, the empire relied on slow, uncertain local trails that made communication and troop movement nearly impossible across mountain ranges that seemed impassable. The Q-Hapak Nyan changed everything. It was a marvel of integration, designed to connect the four distinct regions of the empire, allowing the central authority in Cusco to project power, administer justice, and mobilize resources with unprecedented speed. The road was a political statement as much as an engineering triumph, physically binding the conquered peoples to the Inca center and ensuring that the will of the Sun King could not be ignored. The construction of such a vast network required a workforce of immense scale, yet it was achieved through a system that honored the human spirit rather than crushing it. Unlike the brutal slave labor of the Old World, the Incas utilized the mita system, a rotational labor tax deeply rooted in Andean reciprocity. Men from every village, regardless of their ethnic origin, were conscripted for a specific period to build and maintain the roads. In return, the state provided food, shelter, and care for their families back home. This created a profound sense of pride and ownership. Every stone laid was a contribution to the collective well-being of the empire and the glory of Inti, the sun god. The workforce was vast, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moving with the precision of an ancient assembly line to carve paths through granite, tunnel through mountains, and bridge deep canyons. The engineering solutions employed were nothing short of genius, tailored perfectly to the brutal diversity of the Andean landscape. Where the terrain was steep, the builders constructed steep steps known as asterisk calchañas, allowing pack animals to navigate vertical ascents. They built suspension bridges, often using woven reeds that were later reinforced with stone and rope, spanning chasms that would terrify modern explorers. In the high, thin air of the Altiplano, they engineered passageways with ventilation shafts to prevent suffocation, while in the humid tropical lowlands, they built elevated causeways to keep the path dry and clear of mud. At every major junction, they erected usnu platforms, ceremonial stone altars that served not only as resting points for weary travelers, but also as strategic watchtowers for surveillance and control. Perhaps the most striking feature of the Q-Hapak Nyan was the network of relay stations, or Calca asterisk, which dotted the route at regular intervals. These were not merely supply depots. They were bustling hubs of commerce and communication, staffed by the famous Chasquis the imperial runners. Equipped with staffs and messages, the Chasquis could cover vast distances in a single day, passing messages to the next runner at a nearby station. This relay system allowed information to travel from Cusco to the furthest tip of the empire in just a few days, a feat that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. It ensured that news of rebellions, harvest failures, or royal decrees was delivered with startling immediacy. The legacy of the Quhapac Nyan remains visible today, winding through the Andes like a stone serpent, a testament to a civilization that understood the power of connection. It was the artery that pumped life into the body of the Inca state, enabling the rapid mobilization of armies to quell rebellions and the swift distribution of goods to feed a massive population. It stands as a monument to human ingenuity, proving that with unity, organization, and a shared vision, humanity can conquer even the most formidable natural barriers. The road did not just connect lands, it connected people, creating a unified identity that would survive the fall of the empire and echo through the centuries, reminding us that the true strength of a civilization lies not just in its walls, but in the paths that bind its people together. November 1463, Cusco. The air in the imperial capital was thick with the smoke of sacrificial offerings and the murmur of 1,000 voices, but beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was taking shape. This was not merely the reign of a king. It was the crystallization of the Inca state into a machine of unprecedented efficiency. Under the guidance of Pachacuti, the empire had transitioned from a loose confederation of conquered tribes into a unified political entity, and the cornerstone of this transformation was the consolidation of absolute power through administrative centralization and the definitive elevation of the ruler's title to the divine status of Sapa Inca *. Prior to this era, the leaders of the highlands were often referred to as *Curacas or local chiefs, figures who held sway over specific territories but whose authority was frequently checked by lineage and custom. Pachacuti shattered these traditional constraints. By the mid-15th century, he had declared that the ruler was not just a political administrator, but the literal incarnation of the sun god, Inti. This theological shift was the key to administrative centralization. If the ruler was divine, then his will was the law of nature, and dissent was not just a crime against the state, but an act of sacrilege against the cosmos itself. The title Sapa Inca *, meaning the only Inca or the unique lord, became the exclusive property of the monarch, eliminating any pretense of shared sovereignty among the nobility. There was no co-ruler. There was only the Sun King and his subjects. To enforce this new reality, Pachacuti and his architects implemented a radical system of administrative centralization that ignored geography in favor of political loyalty. The empire was reorganized into 4 great provinces, or Sayas *, each governed by a high-ranking noble appointed directly by the Sapa Inca, rather than by hereditary lineage. These 4 quarters radiated outward from Cusco like the arms of a cross, ensuring that no single province was large or powerful enough to challenge the center. The capital city itself was redesigned to reflect this unity. The sacred mountain of Huayna became the symbolic home of the sun god, while the city was laid out with a central plaza and a massive fortress, Sacsayhuaman, which served as the administrative heart where the Inca court met with representatives from across the continent. The centralization extended deep into the bureaucracy. The Sapa Inca did not rule directly from the throne. He ruled through a vast network of officials who acted as his eyes and ears. The most critical of these was the Viracocha asterisk, the supreme priest and vizier who managed the spiritual and administrative affairs of the state. Under their guidance, the Quipucameox asterisk, or keepers of the knots, developed the asterisk Kipu asterisk system. These intricate corded devices were no longer just record keepers for local grain stores. They became the database of the empire, tracking taxes, census data, and labor quotas from the highest peaks of the Andes to the coastal deserts. This information flowed constantly to Cusco, allowing the Sapa Inca to make decisions based on real-time data rather than rumor. Furthermore, the concept of the Mida asterisk labor tax was refined and standardized under this new administrative structure. Previously, labor obligations were often negotiated locally. Now, they were mandated centrally. Every able-bodied adult, regardless of ethnicity or origin, owed a portion of their time to the state for public works, road construction, or military service. This universal obligation created a sense of direct responsibility to the Sapa Inca, binding the diverse peoples of Tahuantinsuyu together in a shared destiny. The Sapa Inca was no longer a distant chief. He was the father of the nation, the provider of food through redistribution, and the guarantor of cosmic order. By 1500, when the empire reached its zenith, the administrative machinery was fully oiled. The distinction between ruler and subject had been erased by the divine nature of the throne, and the distinction between tribe and province had been dissolved by the rigid four-quarter system. The Sapa Inca stood alone at the apex, a figure of terrifying power and majestic benevolence, holding together a civilization that would stretch across 3 modern nations, united not by blood, but by the absolute, centralized will of the Sun King. 1400 AD Cusco. In the shadow of the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, a profound shift was taking place that would bind thousands of disparate tribes into a single, cohesive entity. The Inca Empire was no longer just a collection of conquered lands. It was becoming a civilization with a soul, and that soul spoke a single voice: Quechua. Before the rise of Pachacuti, the Andes were a mosaic of tongues, from the Aymara of the south to the numerous languages of the coast and the high valleys. For the Incas, the imposition of their own language was not merely an act of cultural dominance. It was the primary engine of imperial control and the most effective tool for unity. As the empire expanded under the Sapa Inca, the decision to make Quechua the mandatory administrative and ceremonial language was revolutionary. Unlike previous conquerors who allowed local elites to retain their native tongues, the Incas enforced a linguistic homogeneity that reached deep into the heart of the conquered territories. This was not simply about communication. It was a deliberate strategy to erase the boundaries between the subject and the ruler. By speaking the same words, the common laborer in the highlands and the noble in the coastal plains began to perceive themselves as part of the same one people, the Tawantinsuyu. The language became the carrier of imperial law, religious doctrine, and state ideology, ensuring that the message of the sun god, Inti, resonated identically from Arequipa to Quito. Central to this linguistic unification was the role of the Runa Simi asterisk, or language of the people. The Incas understood that control begins with the mind. By standardizing the vocabulary used for taxation, labor duties, and religious rites, the state eliminated the ambiguity that local dialects might allow. A command given in Quechua was understood with the same weight and clarity in every corner of the empire, leaving no room for misinterpretation or local resistance. The language itself became a symbol of loyalty. To speak Quechua was to acknowledge the supremacy of the Inca and the validity of the empire's order. However, the reach of this linguistic tool was amplified by the unique social structure of the empire. Through the Mita system, where communities were rotated to work on imperial projects, Quechua spread rapidly. Thousands of workers, stripped of their local identities and integrated into a vast state apparatus, communicated solely in the imperial tongue. They carried the language with them back to their villages, creating a living network of speakers that wove through the Andean mountains. Even in the farthest reaches of the southern provinces, the Quechua spoken by the Mita workers eventually replaced the older Aymara dialects, demonstrating the sheer cultural permeability of the empire's mandate. This linguistic imperialism was not without its costs, yet it was calculated to be enduring. The suppression of local languages served to fragment existing tribal loyalties, replacing them with a shared identity rooted in the Inca state. When a rebellion erupted in the north, the suppression was often accompanied by a crackdown on the local tongue, forcing the population to adopt Quechua as a sign of submission. The result was a linguistic landscape where the sound of the empire could be heard from the coastal deserts to the cloud forests, creating a unified cultural front that would withstand centuries of external pressure. By the time of the Spanish conquest in 1532, the Quechua tongue had already cemented itself as the lingua franca of South America, far surpassing the influence of the conquering Europeans who followed. The Incas had achieved something rare in ancient history. They had created a vast empire held together not just by roads and armies, but by the shared rhythm of a single language. In every village, every mine, and every temple, the words of the Sapa Inca echoed in Quechua, proving that language was indeed the most powerful tool of unity and control the ancient world had ever seen. March 1521, Cusco, Tawantinsuyu. While the Spanish chroniclers would later marvel at the sheer scale of the Inca Empire, they failed to grasp the invisible nervous system that held it together. For centuries, the Incas ruled over an empire stretching from modern-day Colombia to Chile, a vast expanse of mountains, deserts, and jungles, without a single written letter to document their laws, census data, or royal decrees. They possessed no alphabet, no paper, and no parchment. Instead, they mastered two brilliant innovations that functioned as their brain and their bloodstream: the Quipu recording system and the Chasqui messenger network. To understand the Quipu, one must imagine a world where information was not written with ink, but woven into fiber. These were not simple necklaces or toys, as many early Europeans mistakenly believed. They were sophisticated data storage devices, complex libraries of knotted cords made from camelid wool or cotton. A quipu consisted of a main vertical string, known as the Umahuatuna asterisk, from which numerous subsidiary strings hung. The information was encoded through two primary variables: the position of the knots and the number of turns in those knots. A knot placed at the top of a string might represent a hundreds place, while knots lower down represented tens and ones, creating a sophisticated base 10 numerical system. But the true genius of the quipu lay in its ability to convey non-numerical data. By varying the thickness of the cords, the type of fiber, and the color of the dye, Inca accountants could record everything from tax quotas and labor drafts to genealogies, names, and perhaps even poetic narratives. Some historians suggest that the Incas may have even possessed a proto-writing system embedded within these structures, a language of color and texture that only trained *Quipucamiox*, or keepers of the knot, could truly read. However, numbers and records were useless without speed. The Incas faced a logistical nightmare: how to transmit a command from the capital of Cusco to a newly conquered province 3 days of travel away in the Andean highlands, or across the treacherous Amazonian frontier. Their answer was the Chasqui, a fleet of relay runners who formed the fastest communication network the ancient world had ever seen. Operating along the Quhapacnian, the vast system of royal roads that crisscrossed the empire, Chasquis did not carry written letters. Instead, they carried the *Quipu itself, or physical tokens, or even just verbal messages that were passed rapidly from runner to runner. A single Chasqui would run at incredible speeds, covering distances of up to 30 miles in a day. When a runner reached a designated relay station, they would hand off the message or the quipu to the next runner, who was already waiting and rested. This relay system meant that news could travel over hundreds of miles in less than 2 or 3 days, a feat that made the Inca state remarkably responsive. If the Sapa Inca declared war on a rebellious chief, the order could reach the front lines almost in real time. If a famine struck in the southern coast, the central government could mobilize grain stores and labor forces with unprecedented speed. This integration of the Quipu and the Chasqui created a feedback loop of control and administration that baffled the conquistadors. When Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived, they expected a collection of disconnected city-states. Instead, they encountered a hyperconnected superstate where the center knew exactly what was happening at the periphery, minute by minute. The Chasquis were the eyes and ears of the Sapa Inca, and the Quipus were the memory of the empire. Together, they formed a knot of history that tied together millions of disparate people under one banner, allowing the Incas to manage a population larger and more complex than Rome, all without a single written word to guide them. It was a testament to human ingenuity, proving that civilization does not require the written alphabet to achieve greatness. 1400s, the highlands of the Cusco region. While modern viewers often equate the Inca Empire, Tahuantinsuyu, with the sheer scale of its stone architecture and agricultural terraces, the true engine driving this ancient superstate was not gold or slaves, but a unique system of compulsory public service known as the Mita. Unlike the empires of the Old World that relied heavily on chattel slavery or vast standing armies, the Incas perfected a reciprocal labor tax that mobilized hundreds of thousands of subjects to build roads, temples, and irrigation canals, without the need for a massive bureaucratic payroll. This system was the invisible backbone of the empire, transforming the Andean population from passive subjects into an active workforce dedicated to the glory of the sun god, Inti, and the Sapa Inca. The Mita was not merely a tax. It was a social contract deeply rooted in Andean cosmology. Under this system, every able-bodied adult male was required to contribute a specific amount of labor to the state for a set period each year. This obligation extended beyond mere physical toil. It included farming state lands, transporting goods, serving as soldiers, or participating in religious festivals. In exchange, the state guaranteed the laborers' family food, protection, and access to the empire's vast resources. It was a relationship of mutual obligation that reinforced loyalty to the central authority while alleviating the strain on local communities who might otherwise starve during peak construction seasons. The brilliance of the Mida lay in its efficiency. By tapping into the labor force directly, the Inca state could undertake projects of impossible scale, such as the Q-Hapak-Nyan, a 40,000-kilometer royal road network that connected the empire from the Pacific coast to the Amazonian rainforest. The administration of this labor was as sophisticated as the engineering it produced. The empire was divided into administrative districts, each responsible for sending a contingent of workers to the capital or to specific provincial projects. These laborers were not random conscripts. They were organized into rotating groups that reported directly to local governors and Inca officials. This rotation ensured that no single community was overburdened, and it allowed the state to maintain a constant flow of skilled laborers across the diverse geography of the Andes. The construction of Machu Picchu, for instance, was achieved not by a hired army of mercenaries, but by the dedicated Mida labor of local Quechua communities who viewed their work as a sacred duty to the sun. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mida is its integration into the fabric of daily life, a fact that resonated long after the Spanish conquest. When the Spanish arrived, they initially struggled to understand why the Incas could mobilize such immense resources without a currency-based economy or a class of professional soldiers. The answer lay in the social cohesion fostered by the labor tax. It created a unified national identity, binding disparate tribes together through shared contribution to a common goal. The state provided for the people, and in return, the people built the state. This cycle of reciprocity created a stability that allowed the empire to expand rapidly under Pachacuti and his successors, creating an infrastructure that even the Inca rulers themselves could rarely complete within a single lifetime. As the empire expanded into the northern coast and the southern highlands, the Mida system was adapted to suit different environments and cultural practices, yet the core principle remained unchanged. Labor was the ultimate currency. The Incas did not need to conquer the people. They simply needed to organize them. Through the Mida, they turned the entire population of the empire into a single, cohesive machine capable of reshaping the landscape of the Andes. It was a system of human logistics that predated the Industrial Revolution by centuries, proving that a superstate could be built not on chains, but on the collective will of its citizens working in harmony with the mountain gods and the divine will of the Sun King. March 25, 1438, in the heart of the Sacred Valley. Here, amidst the mist-shrouded peaks of the Andes, the Incas formalized a theological structure that would bind their vast empire together with invisible divine threads. While the Incas were conquerors of stone and steel, their most formidable weapon was belief. At the core of this spiritual architecture stood Inti, the sun god, the creator of life, the source of all energy, and the absolute sovereign of the cosmic order. Unlike the fragmented pantheons of earlier Andean cultures where local deities held sway over specific valleys, the Inca state religion centralized worship around Inti. Temples were not merely places of prayer. They were the physical manifestation of the state itself. The Coricancha in Cusco, the Temple of the Sun, was the zenith of this devotion. Its walls, shimmering with sheets of pure gold that mirrored the daily movement of the sun across the sky, declared one undeniable truth: the empire existed solely to serve the sun. To neglect Inti was to invite chaos. To honor him was to guarantee prosperity. This divine mandate elevated the Sapa Inca, the unique lord, to a status transcending mere kingship. The Sapa Inca was not just a ruler. He was the living embodiment of Inti on earth, the divine father, and the sole conduit between the human world and the celestial realm. His authority was absolute because it was sacred. In the eyes of the subjects, questioning the Sapa Inca was not just an act of treason, but a blasphemy against the cosmos itself. This unique fusion of theocracy and monarchy created a psychological glue strong enough to hold together the disparate tribes of the Tawantinsuyu, from the humid coast to the arid highlands. The state meticulously engineered rituals to reinforce this connection. The Sun Festival, Inti Raymi, held every December 24th in Cusco, was the empire's grandest spectacle. It was a theatrical reenactment of the world's creation, a time when the entire administration, from the highest generals to the lowest laborers, paused their duties to participate in the cosmic renewal. But the state's control went deeper than festivals. It reached into the very fabric of daily life through the system of mummification and worship of the mummies, known as the asterisk mummies of power. When a Sapa Inca died, his body was preserved with care, his lips sealed with gold, and his mummy was carried in a golden palanquin, dressed in fresh regalia, to the palace. He became a state entity, a revered ancestor who could still speak to the gods and guide the living. This practice blurred the line between the past, present, and future, creating a sense of eternal continuity that stabilized the succession of rulers. Furthermore, the priesthood, organized under the high priest Wilak Umu, acted as the bureaucracy of the divine. They oversaw the calendar, the agricultural cycles, and the distribution of resources, ensuring that the will of Inti was translated into practical governance. They taught that the land was a trust from the sun, and the Incas were merely its stewards. By intertwining the legitimacy of the state with the sanctity of the sun, the Incas achieved a level of social cohesion rarely seen in ancient history. Even as they conquered hostile nations, they did not simply impose Quechua, they imposed a worldview. The local gods were not erased but were subordinated to Inti, becoming lesser servants in the divine household. This syncretism allowed the empire to expand rapidly, not just by the sword, but by offering a unified spiritual identity to a fractious region. The veneration of Inti and the deification of the Sapa Inca transformed the Inca Empire from a collection of conquered territories into a singular, celestial organism. As long as the sun rose, the empire existed. And in the minds of the millions who walked the Q-Hapak Nyan, that truth was absolute, a divine certainty that would ultimately prove fragile when faced with the dark forces of European conquest. Yet it remained the defining spirit of the Inca civilization for centuries. January 1525, the ruins of Ollantay Tambo, where the stones still whisper of a faith that outlived empires. While the Spanish conquerors would later arrive to impose their own gods and dismantle the temples of stone, they would fail to understand the true spiritual engine of the Inca Empire. To the Sapa Inca, the sun god Inti was indeed the supreme ruler of the heavens, but on the rugged terrain of the Andes, Inti's power could not walk alone. The Incas were masterful synthesizers of belief, creating a religious architecture that respected the ancient local deities, the Apu's asterisk, while firmly centering them within an imperial hierarchy. This was not mere tolerance. It was a calculated strategy of control, blending indigenous reverence with the unifying will of Cusco. Before the empire expanded to its zenith, The Andean highlands were a patchwork of distinct tribal nations, each with its own patron mountain spirit. In the Chinchaysuyu, the Apis were often fierce protectors of the earth. In the Antisuyu, they were the guardians of the jungle's mist. When the Wari and later the Tiwanaku cultures rose, they began to systematize these beliefs, but it was the Incas who perfected the art of incorporation. Upon conquering a new territory, the Inca administration did not simply erase the local pantheon. Instead, they performed a delicate operation of integration. The local Apis were acknowledged as powerful entities, but their status was redefined. They were no longer independent gods of specific villages. They were elevated to become subordinate children of the great sun god, Inti. This theological shift was physically manifested in the landscape itself. The Incas built massive stone temples not just on the slopes of these sacred mountains, but directly within them. At sites like Tinajillas in the Sacred Valley, one can see the precise architectural alignment where Inca masonry frames the natural rock formations, treating the mountain as a living temple. By claiming the Apu as a descendant of the Sapa Inca, the imperial power created a divine lineage that connected the local population directly to the emperor. To worship the mountain was, by extension, to honor the Inca himself. This created a spiritual bond that was impossible to break without severing one's connection to the land and the state simultaneously. The mechanism of this blend was further reinforced through the concept of huaca asterisk, sacred places or objects. The Incas identified natural features like springs, caves, and rock formations as manifestations of the Apis, placing them under the protection of the state religion. The emperor, as the asterisk Sapa Inca and the son of the sun, became the supreme priest of all these spirits. He sent his priests, the Aklas and the Amadas, to perform rituals at these sites, often bringing offerings of maize, coca leaves, and golden artifacts. These rituals were public spectacles designed to demonstrate that the Inca state provided the stability and order necessary for the Apis to protect their lands. However, this blending was not without tension. The local populations retained a deep, personal devotion to their Apis, often viewing them with a sense of intimacy that the distant imperial cult could not fully replicate. Yet, the Inca administration was astute enough to turn this into a tool of loyalty. By integrating the local deities into the state pantheon, they neutralized potential sources of rebellion. If the local god was now an agent of the sun, then rebellion against the Inca was not just treason against a human ruler. It was sacrilege against the cosmic order. The imperial will was thus woven into the very fabric of indigenous spirituality, creating a unified ideological front that stretched from the arid coasts of Arica to the dense rainforests of the Amazon. As the empire grew, this syncretic religion became the glue of Tahuantinsuyu. It allowed the Incas to rule over thousands of diverse groups with a minimum of friction, not by erasing their cultures, but by reimagining them as part of a grand, solar family. The Apis remained the guardians of the mountains, but now they served the Sun King. This complex tapestry of faith, where ancient traditions met imperial ambition, laid the spiritual groundwork for an empire that would remain the largest in pre-Columbian America for centuries. It was a system where the stone of the mountain and the gold of the sun were inextricably linked, binding the people of the Andes to their ruler through the shared reverence of 1,000 different gods, all ultimately bowing to one. December 1525, the Andean highlands, though the empire was already centuries old, The rhythm of life in the Inca state was dictated by a single, unyielding principle: collective obligation. To understand the social hierarchy of the Sapa Inca's realm, one must look beyond the glittering courts of Cusco and focus on the mechanism that held the vast population together: the mita. By the late 15th century, under the reign of Pachacuti and his successors, this was not merely a tax but a sacred covenant. Every able-bodied citizen, regardless of status, was required to contribute a specific amount of labor to the state for a set number of days annually. This labor built the Quhapac Nyan, the royal roads that spanned the continent. It quarried the stones of Sacsayhuaman. It cultivated the state's massive storehouses of food. The hierarchy was rigid yet fluid. A farmer in the highlands performed his duty, a mason in the coast served his quota, and upon completion, they were fed by the state, housed, and given gifts. This system prevented the emergence of a private landlord class, ensuring that all wealth flowed directly to the Inca, reinforcing the divine connection between the emperor and his subjects. However, within this seemingly masculine sphere of labor and military conquest, the role of women was far more nuanced and critical than European observers of the time would later acknowledge. While the Sapa Inca ruled with an iron fist, the administration of the empire relied heavily on the clan and the Ini asterisk, the principle of reciprocity, which was managed largely by women. The social hierarchy was not just a ladder of labor, but a web of kinship. Women of the nobility, known as asterisk noblewomen, held significant administrative power, often acting as governors or managers of local districts while their husbands were away at war or leading expeditions. They managed the production of textiles, which served as the empire's true currency. A woman's skill as a weaver was her social standing. A masterpiece of cloth could settle disputes, pay taxes, or secure political alliances between distant regions of the Tawantinsuyu. The administration of justice and community life also fell into the capable hands of women. In many rural communities, women served as judges and mediators in local disputes regarding land use, water rights, and family matters, a tradition rooted in the pre-Inca matriarchal influences that persisted alongside imperial law. They oversaw the distribution of goods within the Ini system, ensuring that the reciprocal exchanges between families and the state functioned smoothly. The state itself recognized the importance of the female line. The Sapa Inca often married women from conquered territories not just for political alliance, but because their lineage brought specific resources, lands, and administrative rights that were passed down through their daughters. These noblewomen could wield considerable influence, sometimes challenging the emperor's decrees or managing vast estates that rivaled those of the highest nobility. Furthermore, the religious administration was heavily female-dominated. As the primary mediators between the human world and the gods, women played a crucial role in maintaining the cosmic order. The Kaichai asterisk, or Shining Ones, were high-ranking priestesses who interpreted the will of Inti, the sun god, and oversaw the vast network of temples. Their voices were heard in the high courts of Cusco, and their rituals were essential for the legitimacy of the ruler's power. Thus, while the Mita system organized the physical labor of the empire, and the male lineage defined the political succession, the women of the Inca hierarchy were the invisible architects of its daily function. They wove the economic fabric, judged the local disputes, and tended the spiritual fires that kept the sun rising over the Andes. Without their active participation in administration and the management of reciprocity, the Mita would have been mere forced labor, not a sacred duty. The stability of the empire rested on the balance of the man who built the road, and the woman who ensured the community remembered why they built it. April 1480, the high peaks of the Urubamba Valley. While the capital of Cusco sprawled outward in a jagged mirror of the surrounding mountains, another city existed in isolation, hidden behind a curtain of mist and jungle. This was Machu Picchu, a name that would eventually translate to Old Peak, though the Incas likely called it Machu Picchu asterisk in a dialect of Quechua, simply marking its location in the memory of the people. To the modern eye, it is often seen as a mystical utopia or a lost city of gold. But the archaeological reality of 1480 tells a story of rigorous statecraft, profound engineering, and a complex purpose that defies simple romanticization. The construction of Machu Picchu began during the reign of Pachacuti, the emperor who transformed the Inca from a regional chiefdom into an empire spanning the Tawantinsuyu. Unlike the sprawling urban centers of the coast or the ceremonial hubs of the south, Machu Picchu was not built for the masses. It was a city of the state, a testament to the Sapa Inca's power and a strategic asset in a volatile region. The site is a masterpiece of vertical urbanism, carved directly into a steep ridge that overlooks the Urubamba River Valley. The architects utilized the natural topography with such precision that the city appears to float, yet every stone is anchored firmly against the relentless forces of the Andean climate. The architectural style here represents the zenith of Inca masonry. Here, the famous ashlar technique reaches its most refined form. Stones are cut with such exactitude that no mortar is needed. They fit together so tightly that a piece of paper cannot be slid between them. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a functional necessity. In the event of an earthquake, the flexible mortarless walls allowed the stones to shift and settle without collapsing, a technique honed over centuries of surviving seismic activity. The use of trapezoidal doorways and windows, which narrow toward the top, served both structural reinforcement and a symbolic representation of the Apis, or mountain spirits, who were believed to protect the empire. But why was it built here? The prevailing theory among historians and archaeologists suggests a dual purpose: a royal estate for the emperor and his retinue, and a strategic military outpost. The Incas were master planners of agriculture, and Machu Picchu demonstrates this on a monumental scale. The extensive system of terraces, known as asterisk Andes, was not just for growing maize and potatoes. It was a hydroengineering marvel. These stone-walled platforms retained soil moisture, prevented erosion on the steep slopes, and created microclimates that allowed for year-round cultivation. This food security was vital, ensuring that the elite could remain in this isolated location without relying on long supply lines from Cusco. Furthermore, the location of Machu Picchu was politically strategic. Situated near the border with the rebellious Chanca tribe to the south, it served as a forward base of power. It was a place where the emperor could project Inca authority into the heartland of a potentially hostile region, demonstrating the reach of the sun god, Inti. The presence of the Temple of the Sun and the Intihuatana stone, which acted as a solar horoscope marker, reinforced the cosmic order of the empire. This was a city where the earthly realm met the divine, a place where the Sapa Inca could commune with the ancestors and ensure the continuity of his reign. The city also reflects a specific moment in Inca history. It was abandoned shortly before the Spanish arrival, possibly around 1532, likely as a precautionary measure to hide the empire's wealth and strategic strongholds from the approaching Europeans. For centuries, Machu Picchu remained lost to the outside world, swallowed by vegetation and myth, until Hiram Bingham's discovery in 1911. Yet its true purpose was never about tourism or hiding. It was a declaration of presence. It stood as a silent guardian, a stone monument to the unity of the empire, built by thousands of hands using the Mida labor system, proving that even in the most remote and rugged corners of the Andes, the will of the Inca state could shape the very landscape itself. February 1473, near the modern-day town of Andahuaylilas in the Peruvian Andes. The air is thick with the scent of wet stone and high-altitude dust, a stark contrast to the arid coastal deserts conquered by the Inca Empire just years prior. While the world remembers Cusco as the navel of Tahuantinsuyu, or Machu Picchu as its spiritual retreat, a quieter, more brutal masterpiece of imperial engineering was rising in the Cusco region. This was not a palace for the living, nor a fortress for defense. It was a testament to the Inca obsession with order, water, and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Today, we stand before the site known as Tipan, where the engineering prowess of the Sapa Inca Vurlacacha Yupanqui and his successors is laid bare not in soaring walls, but in the precise manipulation of life's most vital resource, water. The Incas did not merely build cities, they curated landscapes to reflect the cosmic order. Tipan serves as the ultimate expression of this philosophy, specifically regarding the Inca relationship with the dead and the land. Unlike the scattered cemeteries found in many ancient cultures, the Incas developed extensive mortuary complexes designed to integrate the deceased into the agricultural heart of the empire. Tipan, often mislabeled as a fortress, is actually a massive hydroengineering laboratory that doubles as a sacred necropolis. The site features 10 distinct terraces, carved directly into the steep slopes of the valley, creating a step-like progression that mimics the flow of water from the heavens to the earth. The true genius of Tipan lies in its hydraulic mastery, which was not merely utilitarian but deeply symbolic of the Inca worldview. Water was the blood of the earth, and controlling it was a divine right of the state. At Tipan, the Incas constructed an intricate network of canals, spillways, and reservoirs that distributed water with surgical precision. During the rainy season, the system would capture runoff, channeling it through underground tunnels and open ditches to irrigate the terraces above. In the dry months, gravity-fed aqueducts brought water from higher elevations, ensuring that the fields, and by extension, the spirits dwelling within them, never went thirsty. This control over nature was a projection of imperial power. If the Inca could command the rain, they could command the fate of all peoples. But beneath this water wonderland lay the city of the dead. The terraces were not just for farming potatoes and maize. They served as the resting place for the nobility and the elite. The architecture itself was a form of mortuary engineering. Massive stone walls, fitted without mortar using the famous Inca **ashlar* technique, created stable foundations that resisted the violent seismic activity of the Andes. These walls retained the moisture in the soil, creating a microclimate perfect for agriculture. Yet their primary function in this context was to anchor the dead to the living world. The proximity of the irrigation canals to the burial chambers suggests a belief that the spirits of the ancestors required the same nourishment as the living to maintain their power in the afterlife. As the Spanish arrived centuries later, they found ruins that seemed alien to their understanding of death. To them, a city so meticulously watered and so densely packed with stone seemed devoid of a central temple or palace, leading to confusion about its purpose. It was only in modern times that archaeologists realized Tapan was a hybrid of a residential quarter and a monumental mortuary complex. The engineering here defies simple explanation. The canals were designed to withstand earthquakes, the stone to resist erosion, and the whole system to last for centuries. It stands as a silent guardian, a stone monument to the belief that death was not an end, but a transition into an eternal, irrigated garden managed by the state. Today, the ruins of Tapan stand as a hauntingly beautiful reminder of an empire that built its legacy on the mastery of stone and water. It teaches us that, for the Incas, death was not separate from the landscape. It was woven into the very fabric of their agricultural and hydraulic systems. The city of the dead at Tapan is not a place of silence, but of constant, controlled flow, a hydraulic poem carved in stone that speaks of an empire that sought to conquer time itself, one irrigation canal at a time. 1463, the Cusco region of the Andes. While the Spanish would later describe the walls of Sacsayhuaman as defying gravity, for the Incas, this was not a question of weightlessness but of perfect calculation. Perched high above the sacred valley, this fortress was more than a military stronghold. It was a testament to the ultimate Incan mastery, the control of water. In a landscape defined by the violent swing of the El Niño climate, where floods could erase villages and droughts could starve them, the Incas understood that true power lay not just in stone, but in the flow of life itself. The engineering feat at Sacsayhuaman begins with the sheer scale of the masonry. Blocks of granite, weighing up to 200 tons, were cut with such precision that no knife blade could fit between them. But it is beneath these massive walls that the true hydrological genius unfolds. The Incas did not merely build walls to keep enemies out. They built them to manage the heavens. They constructed a complex system of canals, drains, and reservoirs integrated directly into the fortification structure. Water from the nearby Kenko springs was not just collected. It was channeled with surgical precision through a network of subterranean tunnels that ran deep beneath the mountain. This underground infrastructure served a dual purpose, a testament to the Incas' pragmatic philosophy. During the rainy season, when the Andes became a torrential river of mud and debris, the massive stone walls acted as a colossal filter. The water rushed into the canals, slowing down as it passed through the porous stone, allowing the heavy sediment to drop out before entering the city below. This prevented the catastrophic flooding that had plagued neighboring civilizations for centuries. Simultaneously, the system captured every drop of precious moisture. Through a series of stepped reservoirs and cisterns hidden within the walls, the fortress could store enough water to sustain thousands of soldiers and servants for months during the dry seasons, ensuring that the Inca army remained invincible regardless of the weather. The integration of agriculture into this hydrological web was equally sophisticated. The slopes surrounding Sacsayhuaman were terraced, not just for farming, but as part of the water management system. These terraces acted as giant sponges, absorbing rainwater and releasing it slowly to irrigate crops below. The Incas utilized gravity to move water uphill to these higher terraces, a feat that required an intricate understanding of fluid dynamics and slope gradients that would not be replicated in the West for another 400 years. They understood the concept of evaporation and condensation, designing channels that minimized loss while maximizing the reach of their irrigation network. Furthermore, Sacsayhuaman's water system was deeply spiritual. In Inca cosmology, water was the blood of the earth, the life force of the Pachamama. By mastering its flow, the Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, demonstrated his ability to harmonize with the natural world rather than dominate it. The fortress was a living organism, breathing in the moisture of the clouds and exhaling the excess into the valleys below. The sound of water running through the stone channels during the night created a constant, rhythmic hum, a reminder that the empire was sustained by the same forces that shaped the mountains. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found this system intact, a silent guardian holding back the chaos of the elements. They struggled to comprehend how the Incas could move such immense weight to achieve such fluidity. To them, it was magic. To the Incas, it was simply the application of reason to the natural order. The hydrological mastery of Sacsayhuaman stands as a monument to an engineering culture that viewed the environment not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. In every canal, every tunnel, and every precisely fitted block, the Incas declared their defiance against the unpredictability of nature, proving that with knowledge and discipline, humanity could indeed defy gravity and shape the very flow of time. In the 1400s, amidst the jagged peaks of the Peruvian Andes, the Inca Empire faced a biological paradox that could have doomed their rise to greatness. They were an urbanizing superstate, constructing massive cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu, yet they were trapped in a hostile vertical world where the summit of the world was also its floor. Below them lay the arid, frost-bitten highlands, while above them loomed the treacherous, snow-capped summits. Between these extremes lay a narrow strip of temperate land, too thin to support the millions of subjects the Sapa Inca sought to feed. To solve this, the Incas did not merely farm. They engineered a new geological reality through the revolutionary practice of terracing. By the reign of Pachacuti, agricultural terraces, or Andines, had become the bedrock of Inca civilization, transforming impossible slopes into productive flatlands. These were not simple garden beds. They were sophisticated engineering marvels designed to defy gravity and harsh weather. Each terrace was constructed from layers of stone foundations, creating stable platforms on steep mountainsides. Above these foundations, the Incas packed a porous layer of rocks to facilitate rapid drainage, preventing the devastating landslides that often wiped out Andean communities. This was followed by a layer of gravel and finally, a thick blanket of nutrient-rich soil imported from the valleys below. The genius of the Andes extended beyond soil retention. It was a masterclass in hydrology. The Incas utilized a complex network of canals and drainage channels to direct meltwater from the glaciers and rainfall from the mountains precisely where it was needed. This system allowed them to cultivate crops in microclimates that previously offered nothing but rock and ice. By manipulating water flow, they created distinct temperature zones on a single mountain, enabling the cultivation of potatoes at higher, colder elevations and maize or beans at lower, warmer sections. This vertical integration allowed the empire to produce a diverse array of food sources within a compact area, maximizing yield per square meter of land. Food security was the ultimate political necessity for the Incas, and their terraces delivered it in abundance. The empire could sustain a population estimated at 10 to 16 million people, a feat unmatched in the pre-Columbian Americas. The terraces buffered the crops against the extreme freeze-thaw cycles of the Andes. During the frosty nights, the stone walls of the terraces absorbed the sun's heat during the day and radiated it back at night, protecting the frost-sensitive crops from killing temperatures. This thermal regulation ensured a consistent harvest year-round, stabilizing the food supply in a region prone to erratic weather patterns. Beyond mere survival, this agricultural revolution fueled the engine of the state. The surplus produced by the asterisk Andes supported the immense labor tax system known as the asterisk Mitta, which built the roads, temples, and fortifications that connected the empire. It fed the standing armies that maintained order across thousands of miles of territory. It sustained the elites, the priests, and the vast network of the asterisk Mitmac, relocated populations who were settled in new areas to spread Quechua culture and loyalty. Without these terraces, the Inca capital of Cusco would have starved, the roads would have crumbled, and the empire would have never become the largest in the Americas. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, they were struck by the sight of these mountains, which had been turned into lush, green staircases. To the outsiders, it seemed like magic, but it was the result of millennia of observation and innovation. The terracing of the Andes was not just a farming technique. It was the agricultural revolution that turned a rugged, unforgiving landscape into a cradle for one of history's most enduring empires. It proved that with ingenuity, humanity could rewrite the rules of nature, turning the very heights of the world into a harvest basket that fed a nation. 1493, a small village high in the Andes. While we often imagine the Inca Empire through its stone walls or its golden crowns, the true heartbeat of their economy did not pulse in gold, but in wool. In the heart of Tahuantinsuyu, textiles were not merely fabric to be worn. They were the primary currency, the standard of wealth, and the very language of commerce. Unlike the Spanish who valued the gleam of silver or the heavy bulk of gold, the Incas understood a more portable, versatile, and culturally profound form of value. A fine piece of cloth could buy a house, pay a tax, or bribe a rival chief. It was the liquid asset of an empire that stretched from Quito to the Maule River. The technology required to produce these treasures was nothing short of revolutionary. In the high altitudes where the air is thin and the nights freeze, the Inca women mastered the art of spinning alpaca, vicuña, and llama fiber into yarns of breathtaking fineness. Vicuña, the gentlest of the camelids, provided wool so soft it was reserved for the emperor and his royal family. But it was the loom that defined their economic dominance. The Inca developed the backstrap loom to its absolute zenith. Unlike European looms that required massive frames, the Inca loom was portable, operated by a single weaver using their body weight for tension. Yet it could produce complex tapestries with incredible speed and geometric precision. This technology created an economic system where the state was the ultimate manufacturer. The Kla asterisk, or chosen women, were a unique class of priestesses who lived in special compounds away from their families. Their primary duty was not religious prayer alone, but the production of the finest textiles for the state and the gods. These women were effectively state-run artisans, creating goods that no private individual could replicate. The quality was so high that it became the benchmark for value. A rough poncho might be worth a single llama, while a royal mantle woven with intricate gold thread and vicuña wool could be valued at thousands of llamas. This created a standardized economic tiering system that facilitated trade across the vast empire. The economic impact of this textile-centric economy was profound. Because textiles were easily divisible and recognizable, they functioned as perfect money. A farmer could weave a small cloth to pay a minor tax, while a merchant could trade a large, heavy tapestry for a year's supply of corn or coca leaves. The state collected these textiles as taxes alongside the labor tax of the asterisk mida. The imperial stores in Cusco and other major hubs were filled with mountains of cloth, which were then redistributed to support the bureaucracy, the military, and the religious cults. In essence, the empire ran on the thread. Furthermore, textiles served as a potent tool of political control and cultural integration. When the Incas conquered a new region, they often did not just take their land, they took their weaving traditions. The state encouraged local styles to blend with the imperial aesthetic, creating a unique hybrid identity that bound the subjects to the Sapa Inca. To possess a fine Inca-style textile was a mark of loyalty and status. It was a visible sign of the empire's reach and power, woven directly into the skin of its people. Even in the face of the coming Spanish conquest, the importance of textiles never waned. When Hernando Pizarro and his men arrived, they were not initially impressed by the Incas' lack of gold, but they were shocked by the sheer volume and quality of the cloth. The Spanish quickly learned the value of this currency, often trading European beads and steel for Inca textiles to pay their indigenous allies. Yet the Incas had already established a system that predicated wealth on skill, community, and the natural bounty of the mountains. They proved that the most enduring form of currency is not the metal that rusts, but the work of human hands that binds a society together. 1476, the high Andes of the Potosi region, where the air is so thin that the breath of man feels like a prayer to the mountain spirits. Here, amidst the jagged peaks of the Illimani, the Inca Empire had unlocked the secrets of the earth itself. For centuries, gold and silver had been the lifeblood of the Sapa Inca, not merely as currency in the modern sense, but as the physical manifestation of the sun god, Inti, solidified into tangible form. To the Incas, gold was the blood of the sun, warm and radiant, while silver was its cold, moon-like sister, representing the night and the stars. These metals were not commodities to be traded. They were sacred substances that required the favor of the Apis, the mountain deities, to be extracted. The extraction of these precious resources was a feat of engineering that rivaled their stone terraces. In the harsh climate of the Altiplano, the Incas developed sophisticated mining techniques that harnessed the natural forces of the Andes. They carved deep shafts into the mountainsides, sometimes reaching hundreds of meters down, creating vast networks of tunnels that connected the surface to the rich veins hidden beneath. Unlike the Romans who used water to wash away ore, the Incas relied heavily on fire. They would set fire to the surrounding wood and vegetation to heat the earth, causing the rocks to expand and crack, effectively loosening the metal-laden ore for easier collection. This method, known as *Huina*, demonstrated a profound understanding of thermodynamics long before the scientific age. Once the ore was extracted, the transformation into pure metal was a process shrouded in ritual and executed with incredible precision. The Incas did not use high-temperature blast furnaces. Instead, they mastered the art of smelting in open hearths or simple clay crucibles. To achieve the necessary heat to melt gold and silver, which requires temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. The master metallurgists employed a technique using forced air. Bellows made of leather and wood, operated by teams of workers, pumped air through nozzles into the fire, creating a roaring inferno capable of liquefying the hardest metals. The molten metal was then carefully poured into molds, often shaped into ingots or intricate figurines, marking the moment when raw earth became imperial power. However, the prestige of these metals extended far beyond their aesthetic beauty or their religious symbolism. Gold and silver served as the ultimate medium of exchange and tribute within the vast Tawantinsuyu. While the state did not use coinage, wealth was measured in weight and purity. A ruler's status was often quantified by the weight of gold and silver ornaments he wore or the quantities he distributed during festivals. It was a system of value where a golden nose ornament or a silver chalice could represent the labor of hundreds of families. The metals were used to pay tribute from conquered provinces, binding the diverse cultures of the empire to the will of Cusco. A province rich in silver was expected to send its finest silverware to the capital, a physical demonstration of loyalty and integration. The craftsmanship involved in transforming these metals into art was legendary. Inca silversmiths and goldsmiths created objects of such complexity that they remain unrivaled in the pre-Columbian world. They utilized the lost wax technique to create intricate textiles, jewelry, and ceremonial vessels. The tumi, the sacred ritual knife, was often crafted from a single piece of gold or silver, adorned with symbols of the sun and the puma, serving as both a weapon and a symbol of divine authority. These objects were not merely tools. They were vessels of spiritual energy, used in human sacrifice ceremonies to honor Inti and ensure the fertility of the land. As the empire expanded, the demand for these metals grew, driving the exploration of even more remote and dangerous mountain ranges. The Incas integrated mining into their broader administrative system, employing specialized labor forces under the Mita** system. Skilled miners from various regions were rotated to work in the mines, contributing to the collective wealth of the state while mastering the harsh conditions of the high altitude. By the time of the Spanish conquest, the Inca Empire possessed an immense hoard of gold and silver, a testament to their ingenuity and the spiritual depth of their civilization. These metals, forged in the fires of the Andes and shaped by the hands of master artisans, stood as the crowning achievement of an empire that viewed the earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred entity to be revered and honored. May 1471. The high plains of Potosi. While the legendary Battle of Marcapamacacha secured the northern heartlands and cemented Pachacuti's reputation as a conqueror, the true test of the Inca Empire's administrative depth lay to the south. Here, in the arid basin of the Altiplano, resided the Kala and the Lupaca, two formidable confederacies that had long maintained an uneasy independence. They were not merely local tribes. They were the masters of the southern trade routes, controlling the vast salt flats and the precious silver veins of Potosi. For the Incas, ignoring this region was a strategic error that could sever their connection to the mineral wealth essential for their expanding economy. Yet, the southern campaign would differ radically from the northern blitzkriegs. It was less a war of annihilation and more a complex exercise in diplomatic coercion and forced assimilation. Under the command of the Inca himself, Pachacuti marched south, his forces sweeping across the rugged terrain with terrifying efficiency. The Kala, led by their cacique, were initially met with a display of overwhelming force that shattered their traditional autonomy. However, the Lupaka, known for their fierce cavalry tactics on the open plains, offered stiffer resistance. Rather than engaging in a prolonged, bloody stalemate that might exhaust the empire's resources, the Inca strategy shifted toward a psychological victory. The arrival of the Sapa Inca in person was a signal that the era of local sovereignty had irrevocably ended. The Kala and Lupaka were not asked to surrender. They were presented with a binary choice: become subjects of the sun or face the destruction of their way of life. The pacification was swift, but the consolidation was methodical. Once subdued, the Kala and Lupaka were not expelled. They were integrated. The Incas practiced a form of forced migration known as **Mitmac**. Elite Kala and Lupaka families, along with their priests and administrators, were relocated to Cusco to serve in the imperial bureaucracy and the cult of the sun. This was a brilliant double-edged sword. It stripped the southern tribes of their local power bases while simultaneously filling the highest echelons of the empire with loyal, albeit displaced, elites who owed their status solely to the Inca. The remaining populations were settled into the **Mitmacuna** system, tasked with maintaining the order of the new province. This southern front also marked the formal establishment of the Sunni Cusco * province, one of the four great regions of the Tawantinsuyu. Here, the Incas demonstrated their unique approach to governance in a challenging environment. Recognizing the harsh climate and the economic value of the salt flats, the administration focused on securing labor and resources rather than cultural erasure. The Lupaka, renowned for their pottery and weaving, found their artisanal skills redirected to supply the imperial workshops in Cusco. The Kala, masters of silver mining, became the backbone of the empire's metallurgical production. By the time Pachacuti's reign drew to a close, the southern frontier was no longer a border of conflict, but a pillar of imperial strength. The pacification of the Kala and Lupaka proved that the Inca Empire's greatest weapon was not just the **Cusillo**, the razor-sharp obsidian blade of the warrior, but the flexible, terrifying adaptability of its state apparatus. They had taken a land of resistant confederacies and turned it into a productive, integrated quarter, proving that Tahuantinsuyu could withstand the toughest challenges of the Andean highlands. The southern sun now shone on subjects as well as allies, completing the map of an empire that would soon look toward the final, tragic horizons of its expansion. In 1438, in the high valleys of the Cusco region, the young Sapa Inca Tupac Inca Yupanqui stands at the precipice of a new frontier. While his father, Pachacuti, had secured the southern highlands and unified the interior tribes, the northern horizon remained a vast, arid expanse teeming with rival kingdoms. This dry, sun-scorched coast was the domain of the Chimu, the most advanced civilization the Incas had yet encountered. Unlike the agrarian societies of the Sierra, the Chimu were masters of hydraulic engineering, controlling the lifeblood of their empire through a vast network of canals and reservoirs that fed the capital of Chan Chan, the largest adobe city in the world. For the Incas, this conquest was not merely an expansion of territory. It was a test of their military doctrine against a power that possessed sophisticated urban planning and formidable walls. The campaign began with the crossing of the Andes Mountains, a treacherous journey where the humid, mist-laden peaks of the south gave way to the dry, wind-swept desert of the north. The Inca army, renowned for its discipline and strategy, faced a formidable opponent. The Chimu were not a loose collection of tribes but a centralized kingdom with a standing army capable of rapid mobilization. Initial skirmishes were bloody and costly, revealing the resilience of the Chimu defenders who utilized the natural topography to their advantage. However, Tupac Inca Yupanqui demonstrated the strategic genius that would come to define the Inca Empire. Rather than engaging in prolonged sieges that would drain his resources, he employed a strategy of encirclement and psychological warfare. He cut off the Chimu supply lines, forcing their agricultural heartland into starvation, while simultaneously launching feints that scattered Chimu forces and prevented them from concentrating their strength. The turning point of the Northern Wars arrived when the Inca forces breached the outer defenses of Chan Chan. The adobe walls, massive and seemingly impenetrable, crumbled under the weight of Inca stone-throwing units, and the psychological shock of the conquerors of the world, the Tawantinsuyu. The fall of the Chimu capital was a seismic event in Andean history. It was not just a military victory, it was a transfer of immense wealth and knowledge. The Incas inherited the Chimu's mastery of metallurgy, particularly their techniques for working with copper and gold, and their advanced understanding of irrigation systems. These technologies were seamlessly integrated into the Inca administrative machine, allowing the empire to flourish in the previously untapped northern coast. Following the collapse of the Chimu state, Tupac Inca Yupanqui did not simply occupy the land. He systematically dismantled the old order to prevent future rebellion. He executed the Chimu rulers, dismantled their pantheon, and forcibly relocated their populations to the southern highlands. This policy of mitmac served a dual purpose. It removed potential centers of resistance from the north and populated the conquered territories with loyalists from the heartland. The Inca administration then imposed the Quechua language and the worship of the sun god, Inti, over the local coastal deities, effectively erasing the Chimu cultural identity in favor of Inca unity. The conquest of the Chimu kingdom marked a definitive shift in the trajectory of the Inca Empire. It transformed a regional highland chiefdom into a Transandean superstate that stretched from the tropical north to the arid south. By 1463, under the reign of Inca Yupanqui's son, the northern coast was fully pacified, providing the empire with access to exotic goods like cotton, coca, and marine resources that were unavailable in the highlands. The Northern Wars proved that the Incas could conquer diverse environments and integrate complex urban civilizations. They learned that true domination required not just superior weapons, but the ability to absorb and repurpose the innovations of those they conquered. As the sun set over the ruins of Chan Chan, now integrated into the Inca realm, the stage was set for the empire's greatest era of expansion, pushing its borders to the very limits of the Andean world before the shadow of the Spanish would eventually darken the horizon. February 1473, a high plateau in the rugged Andes Mountains. The air here is thin and biting, a stark contrast to the fertile valleys where the Inca sun cult thrived. This is the scene of a nightmare that would fracture the very foundation of the rising empire. While the chroniclers of the later Spanish conquest, like Pedro Cieza de León and Garcilaso de la Vega, would paint the Chanca War as a mere skirmish, the archaeological and historical consensus suggests it was far more catastrophic. The first major military defeat suffered by the Inca state, a blow that nearly toppled Manco Capac's dynasty, before the son King Pachacuti even took the throne. The conflict began not with a grand invasion, but with a desperate bid for survival by a small, independent highland kingdom. The Chanca people, a fierce warrior confederation from the southern highlands, had grown resentful of the encroaching Inca influence. They viewed the Inca expansion not as a blessing, but as a threat to their sovereignty and religious autonomy. Seeking an opportunity to strike before they were overwhelmed, the Chanca launched a preemptive attack against the Inca capital. It was a gamble born of desperation, aiming to decapitate the empire at its source. The initial phase of the war went disastrously for Cusco. Historical accounts describe a brutal onslaught where the Chanca warriors, known for their terrifying reputation and distinct ceremonial dress, overwhelmed the initial Inca defenses. The city of Cusco, still a small collection of mud and stone houses, was sacked. The violence was total. The Chanca reportedly killed the Sapa Inca, the emperor, and many of his immediate family. In the chaos of a pre-colonial battle, where the concept of a prisoner of war was foreign, the enemy sought annihilation. The young Sapa Inca, likely a prince named Inca Yupanqui or perhaps Pachacuti himself depending on the chronicle, barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the wilderness. The political ramifications were immediate and devastating. The legitimacy of the Inca ruler, the divine son of Inti, was shattered in the eyes of his subjects. If the god king could be killed by barbarians in his own capital, what was the power of the empire? This defeat forced a radical transformation. The survivors, led by the young Pachacuti, had to abandon the traditional defensive strategies that had served them well against minor local tribes. They could no longer rely on the loyalty of the highland allies who had fled with them. Instead, they forged a new alliance with the powerful Chanca of the coast and the rebellious Chanca themselves, turning their former enemies into vassals through a combination of terror and calculated diplomacy. Furthermore, this trauma became the catalyst for the total restructuring of the state. The loss of Cusco proved that the old methods of unification were obsolete. It drove the young leader to develop the administrative genius that would later define the Tahuantinsuyu. The war forced the Inca to professionalize their army, creating standing units rather than relying solely on levies. It also accelerated the shift from a loose confederation of tribes to a rigid, centralized bureaucracy capable of projecting power deep into hostile territory. Without the shock of the Chanca defeat, the specific political and military reforms attributed to Pachacuti might never have been prioritized with such urgency. The Chanca War was the crucible in which the modern Inca Empire was forged, transforming a defeated tribe into the dominant force of the Andes, but only at the cost of a near-extinction event that haunted the dynasty's early history. January 1480, the highlands of the Cañar Valley, nestled deep within the rugged Andes of modern-day Ecuador. By this time, the northern flank of the Inca Empire, known as the Quilisuyu, had long been a theater of relentless war. While the famous Battle of Quillajarco against the Chanca had secured the central highlands for Tupac Yupanqui decades prior, the north remained a volatile frontier, home to cultures that had never fully submitted to Cusco's will. Among these were the Cañari, a fierce confederation of highland tribes who had famously repelled the Incas 3 centuries earlier, and the lingering descendants of the Moche civilization, a coastal power that had crumbled under earlier Spanish accounts, but whose remnants still haunted the arid northern coast. The fate of the Cañari during the late reign of Tupac Yupanqui and the early rule of Huayna Capac was one of brutal subjugation and strategic displacement. Unlike the coastal polities which offered fertile land for integration, the Cañari Highlands were a fortress of natural defense. The Inca strategy here shifted from simple military conquest to a scorched earth policy of relocation. Historical chroniclers, such as Garcilaso de la Vega, recount that the Cañari people were not merely defeated, they were systematically uprooted. Entire villages were dismantled, and their populations were marched thousands of miles south, forced to serve as laborers in the salt mines of Potosi and the agricultural terraces of the Cusco hinterland. This mass deportation was designed to break the social cohesion of the rebellion, scattering the tribes into isolated pockets where their martial culture could no longer be coordinated. In the Cañar Valley itself, the Inca left a legacy of trauma. They constructed a massive fortress, now known as Quito, atop the old Cañari capital to serve as a permanent military garrison, signaling that the mountains were no longer a sanctuary but a prison. Simultaneously, the northern coast presented a different challenge: the remnants of the Mochica legacy. By the time the Incas arrived in the late 15th century, the Great Chimu Empire, the last major successor to the Moche, had already fallen to Yupanqui's armies. However, the cultural DNA of the Moche persisted in the coastal valleys of Piura and Lambayeque. The Incas faced a population that was accustomed to a maritime lifestyle, distinct from the highland Andean worldview. The Inca response was a blend of engineering and religious imposition. They built a network of roads connecting the coast to the Quhapac Nian, integrating these arid regions into the imperial logistical grid. Yet, the cultural friction was palpable. The coastal populations continued to revere local deities and maintained distinct burial rites, creating a zone of simmering resentment. The rebellion in the north was not a single event, but a protracted series of uprisings that tested the limits of Inca administrative reach. In the northern sector, the Incas struggled to impose the mida labor tax on a populace that was already exhausted by decades of warfare and forced migration. The Cañari resistance, though broken militarily, never truly ceased to simmer beneath the surface of the empire. They became the ghosts of the north, a constant reminder of the limits of Inca power. The Incas responded by tightening their grip, stationing royal guards in every major valley, and enforcing a strict policy of assimilation through the Quechua language. Yet, the sheer distance from Cusco and the logistical difficulties of controlling the rugged northern terrain meant that these regions often required special attention from the Sapa Inca. As the 1490s approached, the northern frontier was a patchwork of forced loyalty and latent anger. The Cañari had been physically removed from their ancestral lands, their names erased from the map, their existence preserved only in the memories of distant mine workers in the south. The coastal Moche remnants had been absorbed into the Chimu structure, which itself was now an Inca province. Yet the distinct identity of these northern peoples remained a shadow over the empire's claim to total unity. This rebellion in the north was a critical precursor to the empire's eventual collapse, as the same mechanisms of displacement and cultural erasure that built the empire also sowed the seeds of its internal fragility. By the time Huayna Capac died in the highlands of Quito in 1527, the northern regions were a land of scars, a testament to a victory that cost the Inca Empire its most enduring enemy and its most tragic victims. The fate of the Cañari and the Mochica remnants was sealed not by the sword, but by the slow, grinding weight of imperial bureaucracy, ensuring that while their cities fell, their spirits remained defiant in the silence of the Andes. May 1476, the capital city of Cusco. Under the golden gaze of the Sapa Inca Pachacuti, the vast tapestry of the Tawantinsuyu was not merely stitched together by force, but increasingly bound by a profound cultural revolution. As the empire expanded from the high Andes to the arid coast and the humid jungle, the Inca state faced an unprecedented challenge: how to maintain unity among hundreds of distinct ethnic groups, each with their own gods, languages, and customs. The solution was a masterful, dual-pronged strategy of assimilation and subtle resistance, centering on the universal adoption of the Quechua tongue and the state religion. The spread of Quechua was perhaps the most effective tool in the Inca imperial arsenal. Before the rise of Cusco, the Andes were a cacophony of languages. The Incas recognized that to rule the mind of the subject, one must first control the language. By the late 15th century, Quechua ceased to be just the dialect of a local kingdom and became the lingua franca of the entire empire. This was not achieved through simple decree, but through a sophisticated system of integration. Conquered elites were encouraged and often required to learn Quechua to communicate with the central administration in Cusco. In return, the Inca state adopted elements of local governance, integrating indigenous nobles into the imperial hierarchy. This linguistic unification created a shared identity. A farmer in Cajamarca and a herder in the Altiplano could now converse, trade, and serve the same emperor. The language became the vessel for imperial law, administrative orders, and the shared myths that legitimized the Sun King's divinity. Parallel to this linguistic conquest was the religious assimilation of the Inca pantheon. The Incas did not simply erase the gods of the conquered, they absorbed them. The state religion, centered on the worship of Inti, the sun god, and the Sapa Inca as his living embodiment, demanded the integration of local deities, known as Apis, into the imperial cult. A clever tactic known as *hastes involved building new temples for local gods within the sacred precincts of Cusco, often placing them adjacent to or subordinate to the Great Sun Temple, the Coricancha. The message was clear: your local mountain spirit remains important, but it now operates under the authority of the sun. By incorporating local beliefs, the Incas diffused potential rebellion. To reject the Inca religion was to reject the order of the universe itself. However, this era of assimilation was not without its fierce undercurrents of resistance. While the state preached unity, the reality on the ground was often a struggle for cultural survival. In the northern reaches of the empire, particularly among the Cañari and the remnants of the Chimu kingdom, the Inca presence was viewed with deep suspicion. These populations maintained their own languages and fiercely guarded their ancestral deities, refusing to fully submit to the solar cult. The Inca response was a mixture of diplomatic coercion and brutal suppression. When assimilation failed to yield compliance, the state employed the threat of forced migration, relocating entire populations to break the ties of their local communities and implant them in alien territories. Yet, resistance also took the form of spiritual defiance. In many regions, the worship of local Apis continued in secret, hidden from Inca inspectors. The Incas' attempt to monopolize spirituality faced a stubborn reality: the deep emotional connection people felt to their land spirits could not be entirely legislated away. As the 15th century drew to a close, the empire stood at a complex crossroads. It was a superstate held together by the powerful glue of Quechua and Inti, yet constantly strained by the resilient, diverse identities of its subjects. The spread of the Inca language and religion was not a one-way street of total conquest, but a dynamic, often turbulent negotiation. It laid the groundwork for a unified political entity, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict, as the tension between imperial assimilation and local identity would echo loudly in the centuries that followed, culminating tragically in the Spanish conquest. The legacy of this period is a testament to the Incas' administrative genius, but also to the enduring power of cultural resistance in the face of overwhelming imperial might. 1493, the Andes of the Southern Hemisphere. While the Sun King, Topa Inca Yupanqui, pushed his legions to the farthest reaches of the empire's known world, reaching the southern tip of Patagonia and the northern arid coast, there existed a vast, impenetrable frontier where the Incas simply stopped. This was the Amazon basin, a sprawling expanse of dense rainforest that the great Inca Empire could see but never conquer. Unlike the conquered kingdoms of the highlands or the coastal valleys, where stone cities and agricultural terraces awaited, the Amazon offered no easy path to tribute or assimilation. The primary obstacle was not a lack of military prowess, but a fundamental incompatibility between Inca statecraft and the reality of the jungle. The heart of the Inca administration relied entirely on the Quhapacñan, the royal road network. This was a system of paved, raised stone pathways designed for speed, precision, and control. It allowed the Chasquis, the legendary relay runners, to carry messages from the high Andes to the edge of the empire in mere days. In the Amazon, this infrastructure was impossible to build. The relentless humidity, the choking canopy, and the treacherous terrain meant that no stone road could be laid, and the concept of a linear, centralized command structure dissolved into the chaos of the green. Without the road, the asterisk mida-labor tax and the state's ability to mobilize resources from Cusco evaporated. Furthermore, the Inca military machine was engineered for the vertical archipelago of the Andes. Their armies were composed of highly disciplined foot soldiers, accustomed to navigating steep slopes, utilizing stone fortifications, and engaging in close-quarters combat against organized tribes. The Amazon presented a different kind of warfare, one of guerrilla tactics, ambushes in thick undergrowth, and a landscape that favored the defender. The Incas had no cavalry, no siege engines suitable for soft earth, and no means to cut down miles of dense vegetation quickly enough to secure supply lines. Every step forward required the felling of trees and the clearing of swamps, a labor-intensive process that yielded no immediate strategic gain. Beyond the physical barriers lay the cultural and epidemiological chasm. The Inca concept of the state was built on the integration of conquered peoples into a unified religious and administrative whole. They demanded tribute of gold, silver, textiles, and labor, and they expected local populations to adopt the worship of Inti, the sun god. However, the Amazon was populated by hundreds of isolated tribes, many of whom were hunter-gatherers or practiced small-scale shifting agriculture. There was no centralized authority to negotiate with, no temple to conquer, and no population base to exploit economically. For these groups, the Incas were not liberators or unifiers, but an existential threat bringing a foreign religion and an unyielding demand for labor. Perhaps most significantly, the Amazon remained a barrier against disease, not just for the Incas but for the world. While the high Andes were dense with people who could spread illness, the Amazon's vast, isolated pockets meant that pathogens did not circulate. When the Incas finally did establish small, isolated outposts in the lowlands, such as the province of Maynas in the 1530s, they found it impossible to maintain them. The climate was alien to the Quechua people. The constant heat, the insects, and the lack of familiar food sources led to high mortality rates. The Incas could not adapt their diet, their clothing, or even their bodies to survive in the lowlands for long. Consequently, the limit of expansion was not a failure of ambition, but a recognition of limits. The Incas were masters of the vertical world, the sky, the stone, and the high-altitude grasslands. But the Amazon was a green ocean, a realm of mud and mist where their stone wheels could not turn, their runners could not sprint, and their gods could not reach. The frontier was drawn not by a battle lost, but by a geography that simply could not be tamed. In 1493, and for centuries after, the jungle stood as the ultimate silence, a boundary that defined the edge of Tahuantinsuyu, marking where the empire of the sun ended and the wild, unconquered heart of the Americas began. January 16, 1524, marked a turning point in the history of the Andes, not with the clash of steel, but with the landing of Juan de Ordóñez de Mata and the arrival of the first Spanish expedition in the highlands of Peru. This moment was not an isolated event, but the crescendo of a series of encounters that would dismantle the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. To understand the fall of the Incas, we must look back to the very beginning of the European presence, tracing the path of the men who first dared to cross the treacherous Pacific and challenge the divine order of the Sapa Inca. Among the many explorers who touched the shores of South America, Hernando de Soto stands as a pivotal figure in the initial contact with the Andean civilizations. Arriving in the late 1520s, de Soto's expedition ventured deep into the northern reaches of the Inca sphere, engaging in skirmishes with local tribes and witnessing the sheer scale of Inca road systems and fortified cities. However, it was Hernando Pizarro, driven by rumors of a wealthy kingdom ruled by a god empire and vast stores of gold, who would ultimately bring the Spanish crown's gaze to bear upon the heart of Tahuantinsuyu. The initial contact was characterized by a profound cultural dissonance. To the Incas, the pale-skinned foreigners with their strange beards and pointed hats were initially viewed with suspicion, sometimes interpreted as gods or demons sent to test their piety. The Incas, having just survived the devastation of the Chanca War, were recovering from a decade of civil strife. They were not expecting an invasion, nor did they understand the concept of a nation united under a single monarch like the Spanish king of Castile. When Spanish conquistadors first entered Inca territory, they often found themselves outnumbered by hundreds to one. Yet their success lay not in numerical superiority, but in the psychological shock of their arrival, their advanced weaponry, and the devastating diseases they carried unknowingly. Smallpox and measles, invisible enemies, began to decimate the Inca population before a single sword was drawn. The disease, carried by European ships, moved faster than any army, blinding the mighty and killing the young, leaving the empire vulnerable to internal collapse. This biological weapon was the true harbinger of the end, weakening the social fabric just as Pizarro and his brothers began to plot their conquest. By the early 1530s, the stage was set for a confrontation that history would never forget. Pizarro, backed by Spanish crown officials, began to mobilize a small but determined force. They arrived on the coast, not as benevolent explorers, but as agents of colonial expansion. The initial interactions in the coastal cities revealed a society that, while powerful and organized, was fractured by the recent civil war between brothers Atahualpa and Huascar. The Spanish exploited this division, offering titles and power to local caciques who feared the Inca king, turning the empire's own administrative network against its ruler. The narrative of the arrival of the Europeans is not merely a story of Spanish bravery, but a complex tapestry of misunderstanding, greed, disease, and the collision of two worlds that could not coexist. As Pizarro's fleet sailed toward the mountains, they carried with them the seeds of a new world order, destined to shatter the stone foundations of Cusco and rewrite the destiny of millions. The initial contact was the spark, but it would ignite a fire that would consume the entire empire, leading inevitably to the catastrophic events of Cajamarca and the final fall of the Sun King. November 16, 1532, marked a date that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization, yet the stage was set months prior in the high valleys of modern-day Peru. The location was Cajamarca, a small, strategically positioned town in the rugged Andean highlands that served as a critical gateway between the north and south of the empire. It was here, amidst the deceptive calm of a dry, sun-drenched morning, that the greatest power vacuum in Inca history began to form, not through a massive earthquake or a natural disaster, but through the audacity of a Spanish cavalry raid. The stage was divided into two distinct worlds. On one side stood Francisco Pizarro, a mere captain with a handful of hardened men, armed with steel swords, crossbows, and the terrifying psychological weapon of European horses. On the other stood the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, the ruler of Tahuantinsuyu, the greatest empire the world had ever known. Atahualpa arrived in Cajamarca with an overwhelming force, 12,000 elite warriors clad in shining bronze and gold, carrying spears and slings, accompanied by thousands of attendants bearing tribute. They believed they were coming as conquerors, expecting to subjugate a humble village and its few inhabitants. They did not expect an ambush. The trap sprung with terrifying efficiency. As the Inca host gathered in the main plaza, a cloud of dust obscured the Spanish ranks. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the thunder of hooves. Spanish cavalry charged from the hidden hillsides, cutting down the front lines of the Inca army while arquebusiers fired their limited but terrifying volley weapons. The Inca soldiers, unaccustomed to mounted charges or firearms, were thrown into panic and confusion. Their elite units, trained for mountain warfare, were ill-equipped to handle the shock of steel against flesh and the sheer momentum of the horses. In moments, the great Inca army was decimated, leaving thousands dead and the rest in a state of stunned disbelief. Following the massacre, Pizarro's men made their way into the plaza to find Atahualpa. The emperor, along with a vast retinue of nobles, had taken refuge in a large church within the town, surrounded by a massive contingent of his finest guardsmen. The Spanish commander, true to his word, demanded the emperor's surrender. He issued an ultimatum. If Atahualpa and the nobles would dismount and surrender their weapons, their lives would be spared. If they resisted, the Spanish would cut them down. Faced with the reality of their defeat and the overwhelming force of the few men now holding their city, the Inca leadership made their fatal choice. They surrendered. The scene that followed was a tableau of inverted power. The greatest warrior of the Andes, the divine son of the sun god, knelt in the dirt before a handful of sweaty European soldiers. Atahualpa was dragged from his throne of gold, stripped of his ceremonial regalia, and placed in a wooden cage. The power vacuum was instantaneous. The capture of the Sapa Inca was a catastrophic blow to the imperial administration. The Inca state was a personal monarchy, deeply reliant on the living presence and authority of the emperor to function. His removal left a chasm of leadership that the complex bureaucracy of the empire could not immediately fill. In the days and weeks that followed, the vacuum widened into a chasm. Without a central figure to command loyalty or arbitrate disputes, the empire fractured along pre-existing lines of tension. The southern faction, loyal to Atahualpa's younger brother Huascar, and the northern faction, supporting Atahualpa's claim, found themselves without a unifying voice. The Spanish, now masters of Cajamarca and holding the emperor hostage, realized they did not need an army to conquer the Inca world. They only needed to keep the king alive just long enough for civil war to consume his realm. The siege of Cajamarca was not merely a military victory. It was the moment the Incas lost their soul, leaving a hollow shell of an empire waiting to be filled by the conquerors who would soon march on Cusco itself. 1526, the high plateau above Cusco. The air here, thin and sharp at 3,800 meters, carried the scent of impending tragedy. For decades, the Inca Empire had stretched from the arid coast of modern-day Peru to the lush rainforests of Ecuador, a vast network of stone roads and tributaries bound by the will of the Sapa Inca. Yet within the very heart of the empire, a fracture was widening, a silent tremor that would soon shake the foundations of the world's largest indigenous state. The death of Emperor Huayna Capac in the highlands of Quito in 1526 did not bring the unity his reign had cultivated. Instead, it ignited a catastrophic civil war between his two sons, Atahualpa and Huascar. Huascar, the legitimate heir, ruled from the capital of Cusco. He was a man of the court, steeped in tradition, who attempted to maintain the centralized administration that had made the empire powerful. He feared rebellion from the northern provinces and worked tirelessly to consolidate his authority, believing the empire must remain united under his iron hand. However, his rule was plagued by instability. His own father had recently died, and there was a prevailing fear that he was not the sole son, or worse, that there were rivals plotting against him from the north. The court was tense, and the great temples of Cusco watched as the unity of the state began to fray. Opposing him was Atahualpa, the younger son, who had been raised in Quito by his mother, the powerful and ambitious wife of the late emperor. Unlike Huascar, Atahualpa was a warrior of the northern front, charismatic and ruthless. He had been left in charge of the vast northern territories during his father's final years, where he had successfully pacified rebellious groups and expanded Inca influence. When news of his father's death reached him, Atahualpa did not simply wait to be called to Cusco. He moved with terrifying speed. Gathering a loyal army in Quito, he marched south, bypassing the capital's defenses and threatening the very seat of imperial power. The conflict that followed was not merely a battle for the throne. It was a war of ideologies and geography. Huascar, desperate to secure his position, launched a counteroffensive. The armies clashed in the rugged Andean valleys, but the true horror of this civil war was the cruelty that defined Atahualpa's campaign. As he advanced, his forces were notorious for their brutality, executing thousands of prisoners in gruesome rituals intended to please the sun god Inti and the war deity. These acts of terror were not just military tactics. They were psychological weapons designed to break the spirit of Huascar's supporters and terrorize the northern provinces into submission. By late 1526, the empire was effectively torn in half. Atahualpa claimed the title of Sapa Inca, ruling from Quito, while Huascar clung to Cusco, surrounded by his own nobility and the remnants of the central administration. The Inca state, once a marvel of cohesion and administrative precision, was now a battlefield. Communication along the Quhapac-Nyan, the great royal road that had once ensured the swift movement of goods and troops, was severed. The Mita labor system, the engine that built the temples and terraces of the Andes, ground to a halt as the workforce turned to war or fled to avoid conscription by the warring factions. This internal division was the fatal flaw that the Spanish conquerors, led by Francisco Pizarro, were waiting to exploit. While Huascar and Atahualpa slaughtered each other's subjects, the Spanish ships sailed up the Pacific coast unnoticed, their small number of men seemingly insignificant against the millions of Inca subjects. The Civil War had drained the empire's resources, alienated its generals, and shattered its moral authority. It had transformed a unified superstate into a fractured collection of warlords, each fighting for survival rather than for the glory of the empire. As the two brothers eventually met in the open fields outside Cusco in mid-1532, the outcome was sealed. The unity that had sustained the Inca civilization for centuries was gone, replaced by the chaos of a house divided against itself. Atahualpa, the conqueror of the north, defeated his brother and claimed the throne, but his victory came at a terrible cost. The trust between the central authority and the provinces had been obliterated. The empire was no longer a single entity. It was a dying beast, its heart ripped out by its own children, leaving a vacuum that the Spanish would soon rush to fill. The stage was set for the final, tragic act of the Incas, a drama where internal weakness would make the conquest of the Sun King inevitable. December 15, 1533, Cajamarca, high plateau of Peru. The air here was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of fear, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the empire that had once stretched from the Ecuadorian coast to the southern tip of Chile. Just months prior, Francisco Pizarro and his ragtag band of 300 men had orchestrated a coup against the most powerful state in the Americas. They had captured Atahualpa, the Sapa Inca, at the very moment he was ascending the throne after brutally defeating his brother Huascar. But a king held in a room, even one surrounded by Spanish muskets and cannons, could not indefinitely hold back the crushing weight of history. The capture had frozen the empire in time, but it had not stopped it from dying. Atahualpa was a man of immense charisma and terrifying ruthlessness. He had unified the fracturing northern provinces, executing tens of thousands of enemies, and preparing for a final, desperate stand against the Spanish. Yet, his greatest weakness had been his hubris. He had underestimated the Spanish, believing his vast army of 80,000 men would easily crush the few hundred invaders. When the Spanish marched on Cusco, Atahualpa retreated north to Cajamarca, hoping to wait out the Europeans or starve them in the high mountains. Instead, he fell for the ultimate trap. He marched into a valley surrounded by Spanish fortifications, lured by false promises of safety. The fall of the king marked the beginning of the end for the Inca political structure. Without a Sapa Inca to provide spiritual legitimacy and military command, the empire dissolved into chaos. The Spanish did not need to defeat an army, they only needed to defeat a leader. By executing Atahualpa on July 26, 1533, in the courtyard of the Franciscan monastery in Lima, they severed the head of the serpent. The execution was swift and brutal, a calculated message to the remaining nobility. The sun god Inti would no longer protect his children. This act shattered the concept of divine right that had held the Tawantinsuyu together for centuries. However, the end of resistance was not immediate. The Inca resistance continued, fueled by the sheer scale of their manpower and the fury of their warriors. Atahualpa's brother, Manco Inca, escaped the Spanish net in Cusco shortly after the king's death. He did not submit. Instead, he staged a massive uprising in 1536, marching his army of 50,000 men to the foot of the Spanish capital. They besieged Lima, attempting to starve the invaders and reclaim their ancestral lands. For a brief moment, it seemed the Spanish might be pushed out of the valley, their lives hanging by a thread. The Inca engineers, masters of siege warfare and hydrology, demonstrated that their culture was far from obsolete. Yet the resistance ultimately failed. The Spanish had learned from their mistakes, fortifying their positions and utilizing the loyalty of the indigenous populations who were terrified of the Incas' brutal reprisals. The lack of centralized command, a direct result of Atahualpa's execution, prevented the various Inca factions from coordinating a unified defense. Different provinces, once bound by the strict administration of the Quijapac Nian, now turned on one another. The Spanish exploited these internal fractures, turning former subjects into allies against their former masters. By the mid-1540s, the last major pockets of organized Inca resistance in Cusco had been suppressed. Manco Inca himself was eventually betrayed by his own followers, leading to the destruction of the last stronghold of the old order. The capture of Atahualpa had not just removed a head of state, it had dismantled the very soul of a civilization. The empire that had risen from the cradle of the Andes, conquering a continent through stone, gold, and the power of the sun, had fallen to steel and disease. The road to Cusco would soon be paved not by the Inca army, but by the cross of the conquistadors, signaling the final, tragic chapter of the Tahuantinsuyu. June 15, 1536. The city of Cusco. It stands silent under the weight of a history that has just been obliterated, yet the air is thick with the dust of stone and the smoke of impending sacrilege. For centuries, this city had been the navel of the world for the Incas, a sprawling temple dedicated to the sun god, Inti. Every wall, every bridge, every plaza was designed with the single purpose of glorifying the Sapa Inca and his divine ancestors. But now, the architects of a new world order have arrived, not to admire the stonework, but to erase it. The Spanish conquest of Cusco did not end with the capture of the last emperor. It entered a darker, more insidious phase known as the conquest of the city. While the armies of Francisco Pizarro had secured the throne, the real work of dismantling the Inca Empire was to be done by the missionaries and the secular authorities who followed. Their mission was clear: to replace the sacred with the profane, the indigenous with the European, and the stone temples with wooden churches. On this fateful day in 1536, a group of Spanish conquistadors, led by the ambitious and ruthless Pedro de la Gasca, began the systematic destruction of the Coricancha, or the Temple of the Sun. This was not merely the demolition of a building. It was an act of spiritual genocide. The Coricancha was the holiest site in the pre-Columbian Americas, said to be the place where the sun god had been caught by lightning in the sky. Its walls were adorned with sheets of pure gold and silver that reflected the light of the sun itself. To the Incas, It was the heart of the universe. To the Spaniards, it was idolatry incarnate. The narrative of the day is one of violent iconoclasm. The Spanish soldiers, armed with swords and axes, tore away the golden coverings that had shimmered for generations. They smashed the intricate statues of Inti, Viracocha, and the Incas' ancestors, reducing millennia of artistic mastery to rubble. The great adobe walls, which had been built using the precise Inca technique of ashlar masonry, were hacked down. The earth was dug up to uncover and destroy the deep roots of the temple's sacred foundations, where offerings had been placed for centuries to ensure the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. As the temple crumbled, the silence of the ancient city was broken by the sound of shouting and the clash of steel. The Spanish were not just destroying stone, they were erasing a worldview. They understood that if they could destroy the temple, they could break the connection the Inca people felt to their past, their gods, and their destiny. In its place, they began to construct the first churches. The architecture that once honored the sun and the mountains was to be reimagined as a cross. The sacred spaces where llamas were sacrificed and where priests performed complex rituals would become altars for the Christian Mass. The destruction of the Coricancha set a precedent that would ripple through the rest of the empire. It signaled to every subject of the Inca that the era of the Sapa Inca was over, and that the only path to salvation lay through the submission of faith. The dust settling over Cusco on June 15, 1536, was not just dirt. It was the residue of a civilization's final stand, buried beneath the mortar of a foreign religion. The Temple of the Sun was gone, replaced by a church that would stand for centuries, a physical monument to the erasure of an entire way of life, leaving only fragments of gold and stories in the wind to whisper of the glory that once filled this place. June 24th, 1533. The air in the Andes is thick with the scent of rain and the lingering sorrow of a fallen empire. In this moment, the Sapa Inca Atahualpa hangs from a gallows in Cajamarca, his golden cage discarded, marking the abrupt cessation of a superstate that stretched from modern-day Colombia to Chile. To the European conquerors, the Incas were a civilization extinguished by disease and steel. Yet, as the Spanish marched on to Cusco and erected their crosses upon the ruins of Inti Cancha, they failed to realize that the soul of Tahuantinsuyu was far more resilient than stone or gold. The Empire of the Sun did not simply die. It went underground, waiting in the silence of the mountains to speak again in a new voice. As the centuries passed, the visible grandeur of Machu Picchu and the intricate walls of Sacsayhuaman were largely erased or repurposed by colonial hands. The vast network of the Quijapac Nian was paved over with Spanish roads, and the sacred shrines to the Apis were transformed into Catholic churches. However, while the physical structures fell into disrepair or were rebuilt, the intangible heritage of the Incas proved indestructible. The most enduring artifact of the empire is not a temple, but a language. Quechua, once the exclusive tongue of the ruling elite and the administrative backbone of the greatest land-based empire in pre-Columbian America, refused to vanish. By the 17th century, a remarkable cultural synthesis began to take root. Indigenous communities, often speaking diverse dialects, were forced by the colonial administration to adopt Quechua as the lingua franca. What began as a tool of control evolved into a vessel of identity. In the remote valleys of the south, in the high cloud forests of the east, and along the arid coast, Quechua survived the Inquisition and the Church. It persisted in the songs of harvesters, in the prayers of the asterisk Ilu community clans, and in the daily rhythms of rural life. Today, Quechua is spoken by millions, not just as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing language that continues to shape the worldview of its speakers. It carries the memory of Pachacuti, the wisdom of the Mita, and the spiritual connection to the earth that defined Inca society. This linguistic survival ensured the survival of the culture itself. The rituals of the Inti Raymi, though stripped of their original political power, were reimagined and kept alive in secret by those who remembered the old ways. The knowledge of terrace agriculture, the mastery of textile weaving, and the architectural techniques of stonemasonry were not lost to history, but were transmitted orally and through practice. These traditions were woven into the fabric of mestizo society, creating a unique Andean identity that resisted total assimilation. Even in the bustling cities of Lima and Cusco, echoes of the Inca pulse can still be felt in the architecture of the plazas and the names of the streets. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the legacy of the Incas is more vibrant than ever. In 2001, the United Nations recognized Quechua as a language with official status in Peru, cementing its place in national identity. Machu Picchu, once a silent mystery, is now a global icon, drawing millions who seek to understand the engineering marvels of the past. The concept of asterisk vivir bien, living well, central to Inca philosophy, has seen a resurgence in modern environmental and social movements across the region. The Inca road system, rediscovered in the 20th century, serves as a testament to a logistical genius that still inspires modern urban planning. The Incas taught us that civilization is not defined by the permanence of its buildings, but by the endurance of its ideas. From the moment of Atahualpa's execution to the present day, the story of the Incas is not one of Chinese letter, but of transformation. They are everywhere in the Andes, in the voice of every child learning Quechua, in the resilience of the farmers tending their ancient terraces, and in the collective memory of a people who managed to keep their history alive against all odds. The sun may have set on the empire of 1533, but the light of the Incas continues to shine brightly in the modern world.